Hello, everybody. We are going to get started now as people continue to arrive in our workshop. My name is Dr. Diana Fishbein, also known as Denny. I'm the president of the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives. I also work at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina, and I have a part-time position at Penn State University. I want to personally welcome you to our third workshop on building the movement to prevent trauma and foster resilience. This workshop series is designed to activate and equip local communities or local coalitions to integrate trauma-informed practices and policies into all sectors of their communities. And ultimately, we want to see this throughout our society. Reaching this goal requires a collective effort by all of you and the people, systems, and policies you influence to become engaged in this process. Nothing could be more important. Mouse problems. Organizers of this movement are the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Practice and Policy and Practice, CTIP, the National Prevention Science Coalition that I just mentioned, and the PACES Connection. And we have over a dozen organizations that are co-sponsoring these workshops with a collective vision to inspire this movement. If you take a look here, you'll see all of the co-sponsors of this event. We hope collectively to inform mindsets, change systems, and reform policies to reflect a trauma-informed nation that proactively tackles the sources of trauma at all levels. I want to mention Dan Press, the director of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice at CTIP, who has been one of the primary impetuses for this workshop series. And I also want to introduce Jesse Kohler, who is the executive director of CTIP, and he will be speaking with you in a moment. And now I want to introduce Ingrid Cochran, who is the new CEO of PACES Connection, replacing Jane Stevens, who recently stepped down and was the founder and previous CEO of PACES Connection. So Ingrid, I'm going to pass this to you.
Thank you, Diana, for that introduction. And I'm very excited to represent PACES Connection here and be a part of the building the movement. And I really want to take this time to introduce myself, but then also talk a little bit about what we have planned with our transition at PACES Connection over the next year or so. My name is Ingrid Cochran. I have been with PACES Connection since about 2018. But more importantly, I really want to talk about how I was introduced to ACEs in the first place, just to give some insight on how I entered this movement. And so a long time ago in a previous life, I used to work with juvenile justice. And I was basically what we would call a correctional officer, but for children 12 to 18. And during this time, I really connected with the children that were in my care. Those children were in a facility where they had either committed 3 felonies, rape or murder. And one of the things that I noticed while I was there was that they were overwhelmingly African-American children. And so this was of interest to me, and it pushed me into academics, where I still reside. I'm still an adjunct professor of psychology for Tennessee State University. And so when I decided to go into the field, I had a lens on that comes along with being a person that lives in this country. So I would consider myself to be racist at the time. I was really looking towards African-American parents as the problem when I thought about issues of our criminal justice system and juvenile justice system and it being overwhelmingly or disproportionately African-American and Hispanic. And so this is where I learned about ACEs, where I really was focused on historical trauma as I began to study African-American parenting practices in grad school at Vanderbilt University here in Nashville, Tennessee. This is where I came across the concept of historical trauma, and this led me to the concept of ACEs and the ACEs study. And this really opened my eyes in two different ways. First, that the ramifications of trauma, especially in childhood and across generations, is really having an impact on us as a society. And it also opened my eyes to the understanding that race was traumatic, the concept of race, and then along with racism, institutional and otherwise. And this had really distorted parenting practices, our individual perceptions of ourselves, our core memories around our racial identity and things of this nature. It was extremely fascinating to me. And then I moved into spending all of my time and my volunteer time really focused on how adversity in childhood is connected to health outcomes and social outcomes in adulthood. And that is when Jane found me, and she hired me because I was already doing the work for free here in Nashville, Tennessee. And so that has really been my journey here. Since being an employee of PACES Connection in the last 3 years, I have really brought in our understanding of race and equity and how these issues connect with the PACES movement. We have started a race and equity group internally that helps us with our internal practices as well as our external practices. And we've also started the historical trauma series, which I think was something that has still been, very interesting for our followers. And so I think that as we move forward, I'm very excited to kind of align all of the different movements that we have in this country and globally along the same overall understanding that we need to broaden our understanding of trauma. We need to get beyond just our individual ACEs and think what it looks like to have adverse community experiences, atrocious cultural experiences, and so that we can have a better view of how trauma impacts not just us, but our societies, our neighborhoods. And this is more relevant than any other time because we are currently in the collective trauma of COVID-19. And so we are beginning to see how trauma can impact us on a macro level. And this will help us in many ways to understand the implications of trauma, but then also to be able to communicate to a larger audience around the impact of trauma and what that really looks like for our society. And so that is the focus that I have over the next year to 3 years, is first broadening our understanding of trauma, to really take a deep dive into collective trauma, historical trauma, how climate change and environmental issues are impacting us as well. To bring in people who are not already a part of our movement. We like to think that even though we have a lot of traction in this movement, your average everyday person does not know about ACEs, does not know about PCEs. And so what does it look like to bring them in the fold? And that's gonna have a lot to do with language, being inclusive as opposed to exclusive in the way that we work, being multi-sector and cross-pollinating. And so we have some things coming in the works to address that here at PACES Connection. First is going to be our Creating Resilient Communities model, which really will look at the individual, bringing in advocates and activists to the fold so they understand how their causes connect to the PACES movement, providing education to help everyone to understand that, hey, if I'm an individual in my neighborhood and I'm concerned with community violence, then how do I organize and ensure that I address this in my community? How do I get the information that I need to understand that ACEs and a lack of positive childhood experiences are the root causes to the things that I'm interested in addressing. Obviously, we'll continue all of the free service that we have around the Growing Resilient Communities model. And then we are also adding services for our communities that are a little further along and need consulting, or they need to be connected in what we call our cooperative of communities, where we are basically moving forward with learning collaboratives and consulting that allows for these more established movements to have the impact they would like to have. So basically systems transformation. And so I thank you so much, Diana, for inviting me here today so that I can introduce myself. I'm very excited to be a part of this movement, and I hope that today's lessons are exciting and interesting, and that we can really move forward from this conversation, ready to mobilize on not just the macro level, but the micro level. So thank you so much, Diana.
Thank you, Ingrid. It is an absolute honor to be working with you and with PACES Connection, our 3 organizations, plus all those that are supporting this movement are just amazing. And we're going to do very exciting and important things together. So thank you so much for that very substantive introduction. We're thrilled to have you. So here is today's agenda. We're going to focus on the justice system. It's going to be led by Becky Haas. We have a number of very prominent people in this area. Chief Leusner, Ben David, District Attorney Ben David, Sheriff Walt McNeil, Dr. Stephanie Covington, and William Mazur are all going to be speaking to you today. Our second panel of the day is on the child welfare system and transitional age youth. And so we'll have Rashawn Bennett. We'll give you more details about this a little bit later, but we'll be, really focusing on children that are aging out of the system and what their experiences are and how to deal with them. So, from a systems perspective. And then I also want, just as a reminder, that on February 18th is our next workshop. So I want to mention that we will be building the movement through transformative justice and faith-based communities. And so we have a workshop that's going to be provided by the Mazzoni Center and the WOHR Philadelphia Center Against Sexual Violence, that's going to provide a full workshop in panel 1 having to do with transformative justice. And then the second part of the day will be devoted to faith-based communities run by Sang-Hoon Yu. And we have some really just very deep and meaningful speakers for that day. Now, before we get into the meat of the session today, a few housekeeping items, if you will. As you already know and are already doing, please feel free to exchange with one another in the chat. It gives us all a sense of community around this movement, so it's very important. But if you have questions for the panelists or for one of us, please submit them to the Q&A and not in the chat, because the chat, as you can see, rolls by us so fast, we can hardly keep track of it. But also rest assured that the chat is saved in a text file afterwards, and we go through it and we summarize it. We identify important comments that are being submitted, people who are attending that have something to say, links that are provided, and so forth. But if you have a question, please submit it to the Q&A, and Jesse Kohler and I will monitor it. Please also store the invitation link for today's session in a safe place, because it is the same link that we use every 2 weeks for all of the workshops. We also have an emergent resources page on our respective websites that will become available and increasingly populated with the handouts, the PowerPoints, website links, and other resources having to do with this trauma-informed movement. And so please check our websites often. You can expect an email asking, asking you to take a survey afterwards. The link is also on the website for the survey. It's very short, and we really want to be able to evaluate, the workshop content and the format and the delivery. And so it's important that we hear from you on the survey. When we go to breakout at the end of the day, if the session ends too soon, in other words, if I get off 5 minutes after the end of the session and you're still looking for the link, know that it can be found on our websites. So you can still get into the breakout session. You have to go to a different link for the breakouts. And then finally, the recordings, the videos of all these workshops will appear on our respective websites just a few days after each workshop. Okay. And just want to say, stay tuned. We're thinking about compressing some of the workshops or splitting them up so that it's not 4 hours of such substantive conversation and information, but we haven't made a decision about how exactly that will be done, but we will stick with the schedule. We just may reformat some of the sessions a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to ask Jesse to take it from here.
Thanks, Denny. And just really quickly before we get into the panel, which I know is why everybody is really here, just to remind folks that the reason for this whole workshop series, the Building the National Movement to Prevent Trauma and Foster Resilience workshop series, is to help you all take action. As you listen today, consider ways that you can reach out to your chief of police, a sheriff, a district attorney, or your own prisons, as well as in the second workshop session, ways that you can reach out to different people in the welfare sector or just others who support youth transitioning out of systems involvement. And for previous sectors, we need for folks to reach out to their educational leaders, as well as develop community coalitions. We hope that everybody feels energized as we continue to go through these workshops and develop community coalitions. Join the National Trauma Campaign, join on PACE's Connection, reach out to us and take action, because it's going to take a community. We need a groundswell of support. We need all of you to help us in moving mountains and creating a true movement that does prevent trauma and foster resilience, create the change in the world that we all know needs to happen, which is why we're here together today. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Becky Haas, who I have had the pleasure of working with on the trauma campaign and gotten to know her as a true leader in the trauma-informed space. She's worked with multiple police departments and has written an article for IACP, the International Association on Chiefs of Police. She can tell you more about all of her work. So without further ado, Becky, I turn it over to you.
Betty. Well, good afternoon. Oh, it's so great to see everyone today. Thank you, Denny, Ingrid, Jesse. Excited about moderating this panel. We're going to really just jump right in. I know it's going to have a lot of momentum. So as the moderator of this panel, I just want to kind of frame up what I think we can expect today. And really now, as a national and international trainer and consultant around ACEs science, trauma-informed care, positive childhood experiences, why I have a heart for the justice system. So as Jesse said, we really want to look at all of these workshops as a call to action. So excuse me here. So I'm imagining, as you signed on, that we have on this session today justice system professionals. We may have community coalition builders. I co-authored a toolkit in 2019 talking about how to build a community coalition. And oftentimes I find people have a hard time reaching out to the justice system, or may feel intimidated about reaching out to your police chief or your sheriff or DA. So we've got some great leaders today that are going to give you some tips. And then also, if you're a cross-sector program leader, we want to encourage you today that you're going to be able to get some information to build your toolkit for growing your collective impact within the justice system. So with that said, the way that I heard as Ingrid shared her ACEs journey, I was working for the Johnson City Police Department as a civilian. I was hired in under a planning grant, and then I wrote, and we were awarded an $800,000 Office of Criminal Justice Program grant called Targeted Community Crime Reduction Project. And there was about 6 of these grants awarded across the state of Tennessee. And the way that it worked, that I, as the director, we had done a 5-year look back on the areas in our city that had the highest amount of drug-related and violent crime. We did a 5-year data look back, and we narrowed it down to 2 neighborhoods. And then as the director, I was to bring together community stakeholders to find prevention, law enforcement, a program to reduce recidivism, and things that were proactive that we would do as a community. And, I don't play a musical instrument, but I imagine the joy a band leader has when they get a band like what I had come on board in our community. And we did everything from increasing street lights to working with downtown merchants as far as with homelessness. I was so pleased to work with our local NAACP after the Ferguson shooting. He reached out, Ralph Davis reached out to our chief about how could we as police be proactive to understand our culture and embrace the rich diversity in our community. And so we started a program called Community Roundtable, which in 2015, we launched our first ever Unity March for Martin Luther King birthday, which was just held here a few days ago. We also launched a first probation program of its kind in the state of Tennessee, working with corrections, mental health, the first judicial district. It was for felony offenders with addiction. And as we navigated through this, we ended up with 19 programs, 35 agencies did together, and we were awarded one of 5 prestigious awards in 2014 from the National Criminal Justice Association. And we were even cited by the U.S. Department of Justice. And all of this was so surreal to me. But what was amazing was seeing our community come together around the conversations of enhancing public safety. And as a result, our program to reduce recidivism, we launched the Day Reporting Center, which has been a successful model in Georgia. We altered it a bit where it's a 20-hour, year and a half, it's 12 months to 15 months. Someone comes in at any, when they are out on probation, if they violate probation, the judges have it as a resource to send them. And they're there 20 hours a week, the first phase, then 15, then 10. And this program in Tennessee in 2012, when I started, recidivism is 48 to 50% in Tennessee. And this program, when you graduate from this program, it cuts it to 21%. And so I had the real joy in 2016 at the end of my grant, working with TDOC, who acquired this program. And in 2021, our governor, Bill Lee, just announced a $4.7 million funding extension to TDOC to expand this program. So what did I learn when I'm knocking on doors in neighborhoods and finding out about a need for streetlights, or working inside the jails, or listening to judges? What did I learn? This really, my friend Jane Stevens said to me one day, Becky, I don't know if you found ACEs or ACEs found you, because I was hearing this in the justice system. And so what I learned was that root causes of crime include household dysfunction and lack of nurturing support for children and youth. I learned that examples of community trauma were lack of housing, food scarcity, unemployment, poverty, racism, and inequitable access to the services. And I learned on many ride-alongs. My husband thought for a while he might have lost me to the night shift, because I would do ride-alongs with the officers and see the calls, domestic violence. In 2015, every every 12-hour shift in our very small rural community, we averaged 11 calls coded domestic violence. And I learned that police work is often like social work, yet they have very little training to prepare them for this part of their job. And then I also learned that judges, police, and probation professionals want to see those in the justice system succeed. And there are often barriers and challenges. You know, we had to get a new bus stop added when we added the day reporting center. And I don't know about your town, but we don't get bus stops added very often. It's very scientific how it's laid out. So I took the director of community corrections, my sentencing judge, and the chief of police, and we went to see the director of transportation in our town to see if we could add a bus stop that would deliver individuals to our program, because the nearest bus stop was a mile away. And many of these individuals coming out of prison didn't have a license. And when the director of transportation agreed to add one stop a day at 8 o'clock in the morning, the judge went in his pocket, pulled out $100 bill, and he said, I will pay for the first 100 passes to help people to get to the program. And so I just saw over and over and over how many justice professionals want to help see those in the justice system succeed. And then I also learned that costs of incarceration are staggering, and yet they're not solving or reducing the problem. And then I learned about ACEs and trauma-informed care in the middle of all that. And I saw that it was a missing piece of the puzzle. And so I set out to train my town. In 2014, SAMHSA had a concept paper, and it said of 21 pages, it said that you need to address trauma and reduce the effects of childhood adversity through a public health approach. So I began to write trainings, because my background is training, content development and training. And so I partnered with Dr. Andy Clements at the ETSU psychology department. And in keeping up our job, I'm running 19 programs with 35 agencies. I'd go in at 6 in the morning in the police department to keep all my programs running. And Andy was keeping her job running as faculty and a researcher. And in 3 years, we had trained over 4,000 professionals in our community. And we wrote SAMHSA and we said, we'd like to host a webinar and find out all the other towns that have been doing this. And that's when we found SAMHSA wrote back and said, you know, we don't know of another town. And so we held a forum in 2018. First Lady Tracy Quillen Carney attended, our own First Lady, Chrissy Haslam attended, and we made the headlines in our local newspaper. After that, I was quickly recruited to healthcare, but I'm not going to talk about that. But I want to just get ready to segue to our wonderful panelists by why justice professionals need to understand trauma is because being trauma informed can improve criminal justice outcomes. And we see that most individuals involved in the justice system are trauma survivors, and ACEs science can help them understand it's not what's wrong with you, but maybe what happened to you. And I love this one. The justice professionals are present in traumatic circumstances, and you are the intervention. And we can do our job in enforcement and enforce accountability, but we can also learn how to show support. And then through your role, though your role is not one of a therapist, your responses can be therapeutic. I was speaking at a conference last October in Indiana, and went a few days early to visit an old college friend who'd been a bridesmaid at my wedding, and she works for a 5-term Indiana congresswoman. And so we were going out to eat and visited a beautiful Amish store. And the congresswoman told me that this store had been held up at gunpoint, which is very unusual for something like that. So as we went in the store and we began to talk to a little store owner, she was telling the congresswoman about her trial coming up and how her detective was coming to the home and was going to pick her up every day and sit with her in the court. And I thought to myself, what a beautiful example of being a trauma-informed detective. And then we also see, as some of the panelists are going to say, share with you, how that understanding and identifying trauma behaviors can assist justice professionals in criminal investigations, conducting interviews, and then next steps of what those need in the justice system. And so my own work of all the different kind of sectors that I now train, I've been doing trauma-informed policing training. I've had the joy of training 1,200 in the Oklahoma City Police Department. I was training the Delaware State Police last summer for the Delaware Department of Education. And in my own state, in Tennessee, when Governor Lee passed a Handle with Care law, I helped the Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police. We recorded this training for our officers statewide so that officers are understanding about trauma on their job and how they can reduce it for children and for other individuals that they encounter. And as Jesse mentioned, I was super pleased to submit an article that was published this last October in the International Association of Chiefs of Police magazine, talking about increasing empathy through policing. And, you know, one thing I just want to leave you with is you hear these seasoned justice professionals share. It's been my experience, justice professionals welcome training. They welcome hearing this information. And so here we have a great testimonial from who was the interim chief when I presented up there, Jeff Becker, about how he felt that trauma-informed policing was very substantial and helpful. And then also we see a recent publication in the National Association of School Psychologists. They did a study, and lo and behold, they found that school resource officers felt often they were not having the proper training to come in with their job, and they all had positive responses. And then in working with juvenile justice system, I've had the pleasure of training 3 courts, and Honorable Judge Powell in Virginia. She talked about how insightful it was for them to begin to understand and think about the backgrounds of the lives of those that are coming into the juvenile justice system. So there's my contact information. I'm going to stop sharing and bring it over to our very first panelist. And it's really a joy today to introduce my friend, and we have presented on other national events together. I'm very fired up about this, as you can tell. Well, you're about to meet somebody who probably supersedes that, you know, in Chief Leusner. So Chief is Chief of Middle Township, New Jersey. He's 24 years experience in law enforcement. The last 12 years he served as Chief of Police. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Chief Leusner to share about his work.
Thank you, Becky. Really happy to be here to share with you a number of things that we are doing here in New Jersey. I am the past president of the New Jersey State Association of Chiefs of Police. And during my tenure as Chief of Police, I made it my #1 priority to raise awareness of ACEs in the law enforcement community and promote trauma responsive police practices to be able to reduce the dose of trauma, reduce trauma when police officers are in the field and on the front lines when a lot of these situations are happening, how we can partner with schools and then build resiliency and promote healing in our communities through getting our kids more connected to community and trusted adults. So when I talk about trauma responsive policing, I always start with the definition of community problem-oriented policing. I spoke at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Training Conference in Chicago a couple of years ago about this. And if I would go in a room and say, how many chiefs practice community problem-oriented policing, they would all raise their hands. And when I was promoted to chief in 2009, I looked to other departments across the country that were practicing community policing and modeled what they did. You look at the definition, it says, partner with the community to get at the root cause or the underlying cause. So the things I did as a new chief were connect people with mental health services, connect people with substance abuse services, housing services, try to have those partnerships in the community to really get at what I thought was the root cause. And then in 2016, I was involved in a grant in public health. I didn't realize what I was getting into at the time, but the hospital put together this team. We got $200,000. There was a superintendent of schools, myself as the chief, CEO of the largest provider of mental health services in the county, and the vice president of the hospital. I went in 2016 focused on the opiate epidemic because that's something that was really impacting my community and my state. Once we started to talk about the issues we were dealing with, we came across the ACEs study and I was blown away. I said to myself, how's no one talked to me about the ACEs study? This is the root cause in many cases. We need to go upstream. So I started, and our group, we started to work together to build a resilient community, a trauma-informed community, and start to spend those dollars and seed that money to start to see practices. What is predictable is preventable. Now, I will tell you this, I wasn't sure exactly, well, how am I going to tackle this as a chief of police? How am I going to put things in place? So these are various community partners. This is true partnership with the community. I tell chiefs all the time, they'll say, oh, I can't take on another program. I can't take on this. I can't take on that. There are so many people in the community. When we get outside our silos, people that are really willing to work with us on putting these practices in place. So the training. I met Dr. Lori Desatel from Butler University. She is in charge or runs the Applied Neuroscience Educational Unit at Butler University in Indianapolis. I met her co-author, Michael McNeil, and I started to see there are things that we can do in law enforcement. So we put together a training program for all of my officers, and I delivered the training as a police officer or as the police chief to all the police officers. Every officer saw the film Resilience, the biology of stress and the science of hope. Every one of my officers, they come out of the academy, they see that film. We also showed this film, which I think is important, from the California Attorney General's office with Dr. Bruce Perry about domestic violence. I had to have a strong foundation for our officers to understand the impacts of adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress on the mind and bodies of kids. And this was my goal, to change the officer's mindset from not what's wrong with this kid, but what happened to this kid. And if I can get officers to have that shift, you see the situation completely differently, and you see so many more opportunities. So this is just some of the stuff we went over on our training. Dr. Desatel helped me put together overview of toxic stress, that behavior is a symptom, that it's coming from a place of pain, persistent state of alarm, that it takes a calm brain to calm another brain, right? That we are feeling human beings who think, not thinking human beings who feel. No one in the history of the world ever calmed down when they were told to calm down, that we have to understand how our nervous systems, especially in younger people, work. And that this is the important part, and this is where I put a lot of my focus, because as a police officer, you want to solve problems. Well, how are we going to fix this? That the importance of a connection, it only takes one relationship to make a huge difference in a child's life. So we started to put this in place. And this is where I really saw a lot of connection for my officers. You'll be hearing from Deputy Chief Bill Mazur in a little bit. And some of the calls, and Becky was on the call with the Deputy Police Commissioner from Philly a couple years ago, where he said, we can't ask our officers to be trauma-informed with the community unless we give them the skills to be trauma-informed with themselves. As a police officer, you see terrible, terrible, terrible things. I don't know any other way to say it. It just lives inside you. And we need to do a better job in our profession. In New Jersey, we have a program, resiliency program, that's modeled off of the military and the FBI National Academy Associates to help officers deal with and cope with the trauma that they see. And I said to my officers, we all know people in our profession, I had an officer commit suicide, that struggle with the things they see day in and day out. Now think about a child who doesn't have the support system of maybe a department or trusted adults or other people that they can count on. The brain and body is not fully developed. Think about how we struggle with what we see. Now think about that child. And I will tell you, I saw a significant shift in our officers. So we did that training. The next thing I did was put in place a trauma responsive police policy Took information from the International Association of Chiefs of Police and Yale Childhood Development Center. Such things as, when reasonably possible, avoid making arrests in front of children, avoid interviewing witnesses of a crime in front of children, don't use children when there's a language barrier, reinforcing safety after an incident, get down at eye level and talk with the child. Questions you can ask about video games or different ideas. We do trauma bags now, comfort bags, where we can give child a stuffed animal or some other stuff that we pass out to the community. Tactical breathing, how to regulate a child on a call. Follow-up visits, that if you can communicate safety, even brief 5 minutes, we try to do with our SROs in school, how important that is. SWAT operations. I was a SWAT commander. Nobody ever talked to me about the impacts of a SWAT operation, right? Nobody ever talked to me about that. How are we going to handle that? What's going to be our plans if children are present? Death notifications. How do we make death notifications when children are involved? And there's a great toolkit at the International Association of Chiefs of Police that provides information for departments to be able to put those programs together, or that policy. This is just a picture of the comfort bags we have. If we're on a scene where there was a traumatic incident, that these officers have these tools or have these things that they can give to the child. Next, we instituted a handle with care program. This program was started in West Virginia, which is a mechanism for us to notify the school when a child was present at a dramatic event. Our typical communication with the school had revolved around if a child was in trouble, that got arrested or there was drugs or something that may impact the safety or order in the school the following day. We did not communicate to the school that a child was just present. That notice has to get there before the bell rings the following day, so that when the child comes through the doors, the teacher knows that something may have happened. No other information, just handle with care. So that if there is a behavioral issue or the child's falling asleep in class, that the school doesn't take steps to compound the trauma because they didn't know something happened the night before. Our first school year, we had 116 referrals in Middle Township. In 2020, Attorney General Graywall issued handle with care directive for the entire state. Middle Township was the second police department in the state. Newark Police Department up north outside New York City did it, and Middle Township did it at the same time. We didn't realize we were doing it at the same time. But Attorney General Graywall, who attended the session that I spoke at IECP, came up to me afterwards. I was president of the state association at the time and said, we need to make this statewide. So Attorney General Graywall in New Jersey has the power to mandate, and he did, all 400 police departments in New Jersey to adopt a handle with care policy. We trained all 40,000 police officers on the impacts of toxic stress and ACEs, and also included in that training a block that connected to our officer resiliency program, where Dr. Kate Tumblety-Felice did a section on officers being trauma informed with themselves and giving them some tools. Our handle with care program, the follow-up visit that's recommended by the IECP and that policy I talked about. In our elementary school, our SRO, he does an amazing job, Officer Julio Ruiz. He has lunch every day with a different group of kids. We have a child that has a handle with care referral. We include that child in an overall group that has lunch with Officer Julio to try to have a positive interaction. With the older kids at the high school or the middle school, we'll try to have a high five in the hallway, some type of positive interaction with the child. Runaways, we completely revamp runaways. Dig a little deeper. Is there something going on? You look at calls for service where children run away. Lots of times there's something going on that's not being addressed. How can we get at the underlying cause and make sure that we're getting support to these kids the best we can? And the last part that I'll go through quickly is building connections with kids when there's not a problem, crisis, or emergency. Our school-based programs. In 2016, before I learned about ACEs, we had one program in the 5th grade. It was the DARE. It's now the LEAD. We now have officers going in the school DEA Operation Prevention, 8 weeks. Teach about prescription drug safety. Our LEAD program, a drug prevention curriculum, 5th and 7th grade, and then an opiate prevention program in the 10th grade. In Middle Township now, a police officer comes into the schools, positive interaction when there's not a problem, crisis, or emergency, good curriculum that we hope is going to make a difference. 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th. That's what we expanded it to. Next, we put together a police youth camp free of charge. The principals will be able to refer kids to the program. We have a nonprofit substance abuse treatment agency and prevention agency that delivers life skills curriculum, evidence-based botman skills, focusing on decision-making, communication skills, trying to give these kids skills so they can succeed. We targeted the middle school where we believe that they were most going to start to see peer pressure and have to make decisions. These are some pictures. This is the Coast Guard base in Cape May. Every Coastie has to go through basic training in Cape May. We take them down there, try to expose them to the military, get them thinking about their future. This is a ropes course to build confidence. These are just some pictures I'm going to go through quickly. We do fun police stuff, but we also take them to do fun activities in the community, cops and kids doing stuff together. The business community supports this and gives us money. They want to be part of this, like Becky said. The community wants to be involved. The goal is a trauma-informed community. We do a little physical fitness in the morning. I don't know how that youngster is on one arm, but she challenged Sergeant Brian, and he couldn't do one arm, that's for sure. We have a dive team. We go in the pool. Again, just some quick pictures. We have a graduation. This is Oscar here. His parents were so proud when he got the director's award. He came up at the end of every day and shook each officer's hand at the end of camp. So we do a graduation. The mayor's there, I'm there, and every child gets a certificate. This is my favorite stat. One of our partners, I've said they want to be in the community. They want to be helping you. 7% of campers said pre-camp they did not have a trusted adult before the camp, but now they do. That is changing lives. That is absolutely changing lives when you look at the research around ACEs. I have 1 or 2 more minutes and I'll be done, and I'll be within my 12 to 15 minutes. I didn't see this coming, the impact on the officers. When I put this together, it was all about, okay, ACEs, how are we going to reduce trauma? How are we going to build resiliency? To take officers out of that cycle, week in, week out, of just dealing with negativity and get them interacting with our kids when there's not a problem, crisis, or an emergency, it's just as healthy for them, in my opinion. Trading card, these are just other programs real quickly I'll go through. You collect 10 cards from a Middle Township police officer, you come in and get a prize back from the department. When we first launched this, we had over 30,000 views within 24 hours on our Facebook page. It gave people an excuse to come up and talk to a police officer. Becky mentioned earlier, it could be a little intimidating to come up and talk to your cop. This helped break those walls down. We had kids chasing cops all over town when we first announced this. E-gaming between cops and kids in the middle school, playing appropriate video games with a life skill lesson. Going into pre-K and kindergarten, our Pause and Patrol program, twice a quarter, just interacting and playing with kids, getting to know their police officers. Shop with a Cop, we did that with some community groups. The Progressive Black Initiative that formed after the protest and the murder of George Floyd came together and said, how can we promote more connection between kids and the police in our community? So they get put with a police officer and they go and do shopping with that police officer at Christmas time. We've done it 2 years in a row, been hugely successful. These are pictures of people posting on our page. Officers know it is a priority for police youth engagement in our department. Just some pictures of our officers. Finally, we talk about trauma-informed community. Police chiefs have a voice in their community to raise awarenesses on this issue. We hold free screenings of the resilience film, bring all segments of the community together and talk about how can we help our kids. Let's raise awareness. This information needs to get to everybody. And I end with this, my final 2 slides. No child says, when I grow up, I want to be human trafficked or addicted to drugs or a domestic abuser. No child says that. And there are things we can do to prevent that. And when I tell people, police chiefs and other folks I talk to, if I don't have you, it changes lives. Well, it is a safer community. And if I don't have you there, it saves money. And then finally, I put in there the expanded improved workforce is because the Chamber of Commerce here in New Jersey has been very interested in this work. Who doesn't remember their first boss and the impact they had and the impact that they can have and make sure they have this information? So that's my contact information. Those are things that we're doing here in New Jersey. And I'm looking forward to learning from the other panelists to see what we can add to here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Leusner. I always enjoy having you on a panel and presenting, and just so inspiring. I love the unintended outcomes that you're seeing, and you know, in my work in helping to train police, seeing some of the similar things. In Chattanooga, the chief, we started cop care bags where each patrol car has a bag to help de-escalate trauma on scene. So I applaud your work. All right, the next one we're going to move on to now is my esteemed friend and panelist, Ben David, who's the elected district attorney since 2004 in North Carolina in Wilmington. He served on the North Carolina Chief Justice Commission on professionalism and the Governor's Gang Task Force. He is a founding member of the Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. Just like Chief Leusner, I'm going to let Ben tell you a little bit more about himself. And with that, we're going to turn the panel over to Ben. Welcome, Ben.
Well, thank you so much, Becky, and hello, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to join you today, and I want to begin by saying that I know that there are many people I admire on this call who've been doing important work in this space for a long time, and I want to stress that what I'm covering today, I don't pretend to be an expert about. I say that I've joined forces with a lot of other people in our community, many other justice officials, including some who are on this call, but also people outside of the justice system, to really look at the science of hope and this biology of stress, that I believe we can utilize this science not only to solve cases and prove them beyond a reasonable doubt, like we do with DNA, fingerprints, and ballistics and the like, but we can actually use the science of ACEs to prevent cases. As the chief said, what we can predict, we can prevent. And we know who our next victims are going to be and who the next defendants are going to be if we do nothing. So what I'd like to do now is try to share a PowerPoint with you. And if we can do that, then it'll be a lot easier to follow along with me. Give me just a second while we work through this. While I have my assistants helping me on this, let me just say a couple of other things. You know, they say that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I absolutely believe that. Your mother has been saying that for years, in addition to nurses and doctors. Well, it's time that prosecutors and police officers say the same thing, because it turns out that the root causes of crime, they're the same thing as the social determinants of health. And when we make our communities healthier, we actually make them safer also. Today, I want to talk about things that I believe are confronting everybody who's listening right now, whether you live far out on the West Coast, and I saw people in that time zone on this call, all the way across this country. We know that we're confronting an opioid epidemic right now. We know that there's youth violence that's spiking in some places like never before because our children have lost the protective factor of schools. And so it's really important that we all come together around this science right now to say, are there strategies we can employ to actually prevent crime? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through a journey that I've been on for 17 years as an elected district attorney, working with many other people in our community. Can you see this slide as I put it up now of my whole team? Okay, these are the 50 men and women of the district attorney's office. I give them all 2 hours off each week to go volunteer in the community because I believe that you need to get out among the people you serve to really make a difference. The most popular employee, of course, is who I've circled, and that's our dog Potter. We actually got him as a therapy dog. He's the first ever facility dog certified in the courts in our state. But I thought I was getting him for children testifying in these terrible cases involving sexual assault. And in fact, he is allowed in the courtroom when they testify. But what I've come to find in the 4 years that he's been wandering around our office is that our employees need him even more than the people we serve. Just as Chris mentioned that there's a real need to focus on employee wellness in law enforcement. We deal with that same toxic stress on the front lines of prosecution. It's not okay that there is stress in our jobs and stigma associated with coming forward to say, I need help. We need to end that culture that says that. I don't like to live in a country where the rate of officers killing themselves is higher than killed in the line of duty each year. And 40% of them commit suicide within the first year of retirement. So I think what we need to do is love our people along the way. And as employers, as chiefs, as district attorneys, as people who sometimes run the largest law firms in their communities, DAs can play a vital role in that. This is the pound of cure that we've focused on for so long. This is a prison cell. We know that we're 5% of the Earth's population in America, but 25% of the world's prisoners. No one agrees with mass incarceration. Certainly, it's now more than 3 million people are incarcerated in our country. It's bigger than 37 of our states. If what we were talking about now is how to really reduce prison cells and to say, yes, we want murderers, rapists, armed robbers there, but not people who are mentally ill, not folks who are drug addicted, and certainly not our children, then what we have to come up with is different strategies for fighting crime that maybe are not traditional ways of prosecutors and police talking about them. And that's the pound of cure that we're going to be getting into now. Let's start with what we can all agree on. Many people who join law enforcement and are become prosecutors do so to help out a little girl like this. It's hard to know what she's experiencing in this picture, but it's undoubtedly trauma. You know, maybe it's parents yelling in the background. Maybe she's afraid of that guy coming into her room later that night. Whatever it is, this is toxic stress. This is something that is not just a one-time event like falling on a bicycle and breaking an arm. That's acute trauma. No, what this is toxic stress. It's every day. And the pressing question that I don't think we've asked enough as justice officials through the years, that we're starting to now, is what becomes of this little girl? Well, to answer that, let me show you an actual young woman who I met the first year I was a prosecutor here in Wilmington. Her name is Amber. I won't give you her last name. This is not a yearbook photo, it's a mugshot. And I think at this point in her career, we had arrested her for shoplifting. Here's 2 years later. Same girl. Now it's prostitution, because when you're addicted, you'll do anything to afford it. And this is what crack cocaine looks like. Now it's heroin. Same young woman. And what a difference a decade makes. Should we be surprised that she's in our jail tonight? Wherever you are in America, my guess is that there are many people struggling into grips of addiction who are serving out life sentences maybe 2 weeks at a time. They're in that revolving door that's in and out of the justice system. And why is that? Despite all our best efforts with drug treatment courts and other innovative approaches that we have championed here in this district, why? And we know the answer. The true gateway drug to heroin is not pot. It's not even pills, although 80% of all heroin addicts do start with pills and 75% of them start with someone else's pills. So it's very important to stop pills being out on the street. Now, the true gateway drug, as we all know, is childhood trauma. It's people who are medicating their pain and who are seeking outside sources to deal with it. We can do better in America than we're doing right now. I want you to consider that over this last year, over 100,000 people died of drug overdoses, usually from opioids and fentanyl. That's more than car wrecks. It's more than gunshots. It's now the leading cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds in our country. I believe we can fight the heroin and opioid epidemic by understanding ACEs. First thing we need to do in law enforcement is what we say we don't do anymore, which is we don't blame victims. She's not a prostitute. She's being prostituted. He's not a drug addict. He's a young man struggling with addiction. Judge Corpening, my chief district court judge who's on the line right now, he and I both went to Wake Forest Law School. We say there's no such thing as a problem kid, only a kid with problems. We need to change the nouns to the verbs in order to get to where we really are, which is not what's wrong with you, but of course, what happened to you. And when we understand that childhood trauma, we can look at it through a different lens as justice officials when we're intaking these cases. Here's another thing I found a few years ago. like many places in America, we now do what's called crime mapping. That's where we look at statistics, crime reports, hospital reports, shot spotter data, literally triangulating the sound of gunfire to specific locations in our community to know where the crime is occurring. Once we found out where the high crime areas were, and again, we didn't pick this location based on any demographic information other than where is the crime happening, we drew a big zone around it. And we called it the Youth Enrichment Zone. We patterned it after the national best practice, which I highly commend to all of you, which is the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. We knew that we wanted to bring in a lot of resources like great baby colleges and schools to get to the root causes of what we were seeing in so much gang violence that was eating up these neighborhoods. And what we decided to do was send social workers in to work with them. This was a decade plus ago, under the roofs of these children, to find out where they were coming from and what their challenges were like. And here's what we found. Not surprisingly, when kids lack structure at home, they find it in each other. That's called a gang in many places. But when we peeled back the onion a little bit more, here's what we found in just the one school that was taking on all these children for just an 8th grade class. There were 84 homes, 256 children, just 4 dads. Now that's not unique. In fact, I think if you were to go to many hotspots in this country, you're going to find similar challenges. And of course, it almost overlays exactly with the high poverty we're seeing and these ACEs that we're all familiar with. You are the experts on this, but just to remind us, these are the 10 questions you can ask. And there's profound implications for people who answer yes to 4 or more of these questions, 6 or more of these questions, right? We know that it has high predictive value of being justice involved one day. Someone who answers 6 or more of these questions, yes, has a 20-year less life expectancy than everyone else. But for police and prosecutors, we know that 70% greater likelihood of being a defendant or a victim of a violent crime if you answer 4 or more of these questions, yes. 62% of the IV drug users here in Wilmington, North Carolina, answer 4 or more of these questions, yes. How are you doing in your community? It's the same, and we know that. I love the pair of ACEs. I know many of you are familiar with this also. When I think of the tree, those 10 questions, I think of that little girl huddling in the corner. I think of the opioid epidemic. And when I think about the kids in our youth enrichment zone and all the things we're trying to do them to get to a place of safety instead of a place of danger, I think of the roots. I think of those adverse community environments that they're in and realize that we have a real structural inequality that's everyone's talking about in America, and police and prosecutors, particularly in this last couple of years, have focused on it like never before. So what do we do about all this? Well, first, we need to recognize again that it's about justice involvement, and the higher the ACE score, we know the greater the risk of substance abuse, mental illness, incarceration, and the list goes on. And so if we know that, if we can predict that, we can prevent it. So what I really want to stress to all of you is something I've come to see in my 23 years of being a prosecutor. I've seen now not just the same individual grow up, but sometimes whole family units come through this system. And it's absolutely true that today's victim is tomorrow's defendant. It's also true, and I love this from the movie Resilience, I'm sure you've heard this before, we need to do a paradigm shift. What's wrong with you is what we used to ask. We need to now ask what's happened to you. And what all of us should be asking who are familiar with this science is, how do we build a resilient community? Well, I'd like to take you on a really 17-year journey since I've been the elected district attorney to involve my office in those community outreach efforts, that 2 hours off each week per employee and how we engage. There's a great book called Community, The Structure for Belonging, which is really what community is. You know, belong means ownership, like something belongs to you and you want stakeholders. Belong means membership, and you want to belong to something bigger than yourself. And we want our kids to belong to boys and girls clubs and sports teams, but not to the Crips and the Bloods and the MS-13. And belong means longing to be, the idea that you can self-actualize in this place and that there really is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's a value for the place you call home. We call it the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, which is inextricably bound up with life and liberty that prosecutors and police spend so much time trying to protect and promote. And so what I did is I created this Starfish model and worked with a lot of local people to say, let's have 5 arms of outreach, these 5 groups that really give structure to belonging, particularly for our children, to make them more resilient, to, in other words, build their bounce back potential so that we're not going to see them justice involved with these diseases of despair. And so I want to just walk you through some of these community outreach efforts, because again, what we're centering it all around is public health. Because again, this is about the social determinants of health being the same as the root causes of crime. So let's go around the Starfish. Let's just look at each of these 5 arms of outreach very quickly, and then I'm going to end it. The first is government plays a real role. Here's the law enforcement leaders to reduce crime and incarceration. Remember when I told you about mass incarceration? Here we are 5 years ago, right before we met with President Obama. This is at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And these are officers, mostly from very large police agencies. And by the way, I'm 6 feet tall. Look how tall you have to be in order to be a Metro Chief. But what we said is, you know what? We can reduce crime and incarceration. And we can reinvest the money that we are saving in incarceration back into our communities. I was fortunate at the time to be the president of the North Carolina Conference of District Attorneys. We passed what's called justice reinvestment, where we changed the structured sentencing charts for what goes to prison and for how long. We made it mandatory to get probation for drug possession offenses. We reduced habitual felon sentencing, got rid of mandatory minimums with some cases. And we raised the juvenile age from 16 to 18, last in America to do that. And in just 8 short years, while our state has continued to explode with population, we've closed 11 prisons. We've reduced the prison population by 10%. That's 4,000 beds. We've saved $500 million in the process. And that's allowed us to reinvest this into drug intervention efforts, into reentry programs and the like that really matter for the lives of former offenders and for people who need interventions, and also prevention programs that the chief was just talking about. Next, we realized the interrelationship between schools and courts. They're inversely related. If you're in school, you're not in court. But if you drop out, 2 out of 3 people in America are high school dropouts. We went back into that youth enrichment zone. We reopened Michael Jordan's old middle school. That's the one on the left. We opened the first ever charter school, all girls charter school in North Carolina for first generation bound girls that are going to be going off to college. She will go to college is what we say at Girls Leadership of Wilmington. And by increasing graduation rates over a 3-year period in the youth enrichment zone by over 25%, we reduced violent crime by 28%. We know, and this is a whole other talk, and I would encourage Judge Corpening to be a speaker for all of you one day, but we've reduced that school to prison pipeline that they talk about by insisting that school discipline be handled at school and not be turned into juvenile petitions. And we really work with our school resource officers and administrators to say, keep most of that stuff at school, save us for when you have the violent crime and the real necessity to make it a juvenile petition. Next, I turned to the business community, and we had over 200 business leaders come forward. And here was my pitch. Just one job per person who's justice involved. We'll background check them for you. We'll drug test if required. We're going to be transparent about exactly who is before you. We're going to give you a 40-hour job interview before they get in there as someone who has earned the right to have a second chance. But the street's always been an equal opportunity employer. And if you're not giving people a chance, they're going to be out on that corner. Chip Mahan, who is a CEO of Live Oak Bank, that's now traded on the New York Stock Exchange and headquartered here. He was my partner in crime, so to speak, with the business community. 500 some people later who have now received jobs through this program. I can tell you that it's greatly reducing the crime rate here by creating opportunity. We also championed a law that's the most expansive expungement in the country, a Second Chances Act, North Carolina Second Chances Act, because even one nonviolent felony on someone's record reduces their future earning potential by 40%. And when you're talking about building resilient communities, this is not the government that's going to do it, it's families. And we have to remember the people raising the children we're talking about, make sure they have opportunities. So really that's the key. You have to make the whole family succeed and not just think about the children in isolation from them. If you want to learn more about this program, go to stepupwilmington.org. And then we went to the jail that was immediately across the street from the courthouse that 16 years ago moved out to the suburbs, leaving a hollow shell between us and First Baptist Church. Many communities, of course, started with a church on one side and a courthouse on the other. And through time, they put a place of incarceration in the center. Well, now that these cores of our communities are getting bigger and more valuable, they tend to move the jails and leave these hollowed out places, and no one knows what to do with them. All the downtown houses of faith got together and said, this former place of incarceration is going to be a place of transformation. We're going to put in what's now 20 different nonprofits working directly with anti-poverty efforts with resilience. We're going to have our drug treatment court in there, I mentioned. Step Up Ministries is in there. We're going to have mental health counseling for our veterans. We're going to have domestic violence training. We're going to have anti-human trafficking efforts under that roof. A place of synergy. In other words, where there was conflict, there's now collaboration. If you want to learn more about that effort through the faith-based community that we're doing on that arm of the Starfish, go to harrelsoncenter.org. And then we really wanted to get all of our nonprofits together. We have over 1,000 in Wilmington for a population that serves about 250,000. That's a lot. And we said they're going in a lot of different directions in agency-specific work. They do wonderful things, but let's not get tied up on agendas. We're here about our children. Let's move the needle and let's see which ones are. What if we all start stroking in the same direction with data-driven alignment? So we really started using some of the same big data that they do in investment banking and in playing Moneyball with sports, and saying we can do the same thing with putting resources in the right places in our community with data-driven alignment. And finally, we put all of those into just one effort, and that was the collective impact around this resilience movement. And we called it capefearcollective.org. I really encourage you to go onto that website if you want to see the dashboard that we've created for our nonprofit partners and some of the issues we're taking on to make our community more resilient. And of course, where we pointed all our efforts was at our hospital, our largest employer, because again, the ounce of prevention is truly worth a pound of cure. Making those kids more resilient, having those checklists that say, and that, by the way, there's schools, for instance, that are already doing the 10 ACEs question, like Glow of Wilmington. So we're getting assessments at an early age. You can know 70% of those ACE scores when a baby is born and checking out of that hospital generally. So we're really working with the hospitals now to say, how do we become more resilient and how can we all work together to prevent crime? One thing we've done is we've created this task force, and I'm very proud that there are so many members of our New Hanover County Resiliency Task Force on this call today. There's several hundred members of our community that are all now speaking the same language because of this great group and the wonderful work they're doing. Shout out to not only Carrie Sipp and her organization locally, but to Smart Start, who first showed us the movie Resilience years ago and got us all on the same page. I'm very flattered that they've adopted the Starfish as their logo. I hope it's because of the Starfish model I've been talking about. But we're not just trying to do this at the local level, we're taking it to the state level. Here's our Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Paul Newby. To his right, your left, is Andrew Heath, who is head of the Consolidated Court Systems that we call the AOC, or the Administrative Office of the Courts. We have 100 great counties in North Carolina, and they're all under the umbrella of the AOC. We all have a courthouse. There's 43 elected district attorneys. I'm just one of them. They asked me and Andrew to co-chair the Chief Justice's task force on making our courts more trauma-informed, ACEs informed. And you can see our mission statement there. If you want to follow the work of the 20 different justice officials, and including public defenders, DAs, sheriff's chiefs, district superior court judges, guardian ad litem, we're all doing the same work right now. What are we doing? Well, the first thing we're focusing on is education and training. We're working with Duke, and they've quite literally written the book on a lot of the trauma-informed care that's going on out there. The Bolsh Institute is specifically training judges in juvenile courts. And we understand that a lot of this resides not in criminal caseloads, but in DSS and in family courts, abuse, neglect, dependency. The Conference of DAs, the Conference of Clerks, the Conference of Judges, they're all under the AOC, and we're now blasting out some of this training regarding ACEs directly to them. With the click of a mouse button, we can get to 7,000 of them now. And we're also working on program development. I saw Lynn Tepper on this call. We're really interested in what's going on down in Florida. I'm a huge fan of what Becky Haas is doing in Tennessee. In other words, we look for national best practices and unabashedly we try to steal them. What we're really focusing in on now is the baby court model in Florida. We're really big on treatment courts, community recovery courts for mental illness, for veterans treatment. We don't call it post-traumatic stress disorder. There's nothing wrong with you if you have post-traumatic stress after you've experienced what many of them have experienced. What we're talking about now is how to navigate from it. We're also putting people in our local jails and in our prisons to say, if you're about to get out, let's get you right to treatment. That critical piece of, while you still have a quote unquote captive audience, bringing them to their first shot of, the drug that might help them stay off the other drugs, or to get them to that therapy appointment. I'll also say that, circling finally back to wellness, we do need to end the stigma. It's not us against them. Police are guardians, they're not warriors. Too often they're only made famous when they involve a use of force case or a viral video. Every year I try to have what I call Service Above Self awards, where we talk about the wonderful community-based policing that's been going on that Chris just talked about. I highly commend that to any district attorney who might be on the line and anyone who is in Rotary. That's the motto of Rotary. I think there's an opportunity to celebrate people who are trying to do this work and build that relationship, particularly between the people most in need of justice, who are in those adverse community environments and adverse childhood experiences. And we're doing that one child at a time and one police officer at a time. I'll end by saying I have a website that spells out a lot of this. I've done an 18-minute TED Talk on building a more resilient North Carolina that's on here. I've also written a book about the Starfish Model that you can find on there. You can send me an email if you'd like to get the code for it that will give you a discount if you're in the justice system. And I'd be happy to get in touch with you through this website. I know that there's several communities that are doing this work. And again, I don't pretend to be an expert. What I say is this thing that we're doing here, I know can translate to other communities because I've taken some of your best work and brought it here. And if it's something we can help in sharing it, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to say just a few things today. I know it's run long, but I hope it's been worth it. Thank you.
Thank you, DA David. Always so inspiring and so rich. He also has a wonderful TED Talk. I quote him very often in a lot of my training. So we certainly applaud the work that you're doing and hope that it could be replicated in all the states. Our next distinguished panelist, he's the only one I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting. We have exchanged a few emails, but I do know two of his biggest fans, Judge Lynn Tepper and Dr. Mimi Graham, who I've worked with on some projects in Florida and heard so many great things about your work. Sheriff McNeil, he is elected sheriff of Leon County as of 2016. He's a 40-year distinguished law enforcement career and a public servant. So since we're running short on time, I'm going to turn it over to him and welcome you to our panel, Sheriff McNeil.
Well, thank you all for the opportunity to speak. And I must say that our previous speakers covered this issue extremely well. And I'm going to try not to trace where they just come from. But let me say first that these issues of resiliency and building some environments where we work on trying to prevent trauma are the key, I believe, to our successes as law enforcement organizations and as communities. I think, as the chief said previously, getting away from the fundamental old regime in terms of how we police communities, seeing the police as this group of folks who are only in this silo. I think that we all now understand how important it is to see trauma and resiliency from the entire community perspective, and that is to build relationships and build understanding within the context of communities that allow us to be extremely focused on the issues that are faced in all of our communities across this country. What we've done here in Leon County specifically as it relates to this is, as I took over as sheriff, we wanted to talk specifically about this notion of policing and communities being so separate and not seeing issues in the same light. We embarked upon what we call an all-in approach to policing in our community, building on the notion that, as Sir Robert Peel said so many years ago, that the police are the citizens and the citizens are our police. And in that regard, what we said was we had a crime rate that had reached something like 20% increase a year over about a 5-year period of time. And what I said to the citizens of Leon County here in Florida is that law enforcement cannot drive this crime down without the assistance and the involvement of our citizens, particularly realizing that many of those underserved communities, African-American communities specifically, are victimized by some social issues that are going unaddressed. Quite honestly, I was extremely satisfied with the fact that our chambers of commerce here in Leon County understood that issue and sat down with me and started talking about what can we in fact do as a chamber, and what can we do as business persons in our community. Having served as the Secretary of Department of Corrections here in the state of Florida, I knew that one of those inroads into our communities that creates this trauma, particularly deals with families of persons who are formerly incarcerated and those children. So we talked about the fact that one, we need to do something on the front end while persons are incarcerated coming back into our communities. And then secondly, how do we then rebuild those families? Those are crucial components, and it's very difficult for our societies and communities to focus in that regard. So we took this on as a significant challenge in our community, and we built a reentry portal in our detention facility, and we've built the capacity for social service organizations to come to our location. We have a business office where they have rooms and where they can come and talk to inmates as they come back in our community, talk about the various jobs that are available, and then connect those inmates not only with those jobs, but also with families. One of the things we do that I think is perhaps different is that instead of having children visit our inmates while they're incarcerated, we talk about trauma and we talk about resilience. Well, obviously, from my perspective, you traumatize a kid a second time if you bring he or her to a prison or to a jail and put them in that environment to interact with their loved one. What we've tried to do is we partnered with our libraries here in Leon County, and we've set up remote video visitations at the libraries with the children and the loved one. The loved one obviously is still incarcerated, but has the opportunity through the video visitation to have those contacts with their children. We believe we've just started this. This is about 6 months of doing that. We believe we're going to see some significant improvements in those relationships. The other thing that the chief spoke about in terms of trauma, particularly as it relates to, in my case, deputies. As our deputies are engaged, particularly in our schools, one of the things that we know, and I think the chief talked about this, so I'll reiterate a little bit, is that a child who is in a house where mom is being battered or the husband's being battered or whomever it is, in those circumstances, those children are there and they see what's going on. The next day they come to school and they then act out. And what usually happens is those kids are expelled from school or go on and continue to have problems and issues. what we've done is to make sure that our deputies, when they make those contacts, that we then train our deputies to look at trauma, to understand the trauma that the kid's involved in. We'll talk about resiliency, but we then try to pass that child and that information on to the school and to the counselors at the school. So when Johnny shows up on Monday morning after a weekend of seeing these circumstances, he or she is now being met by a counselor who understands and start to try to treat that child. So that's one of the innovations that we work so diligently on. The other aspect of our entire effort we call All In, again, the All In platform, we have taken some additional steps with respect to trying to build resiliency and capacity in our community. One of the things we understood very immediately after I became sheriff was that we needed a concerted effort to deal with children issues in our community. I think you all talked about the fact that we have disparate social service organizations. We have groups that provide services that are not sometimes coordinated. What we decided to do, and not just with my leadership, but the leadership of the entire city of Tallahassee and county of Leon, was to focus on trying to build what we call a children's services council. We got these in the state of Florida, across the state. We didn't have one here in Leon County. And we went about talking to our citizens about the prospects of creating a penny sales tax, where those dollars specifically would go to trying to address the early childhood experiences, of adverse childhood experiences of the youth of our community. I'm glad to tell you that the citizens of Leon County overwhelmingly agreed that we should put dollars in place and build this Children's Services Council. The council is still in process. We have not had meetings just yet. No monies have been spent, but we've been building that council up so that we can, in fact, have those outcomes that you all talked about. The last thing I'll talk about here this afternoon is we in the Leon County Sheriff's Office, realizing the problems and the issues that we face in terms of crime. One of the things we realized during the 6 years I've been sheriff, we've driven crime down about 5 to 7% each year, mostly focused on relationships we've got with social service organizations and their abilities to go into these at-risk communities. Particularly, we have a zip code 32304, which is the poorest zip code in the state of Florida. And so we poured resources into those areas. But we then realized, and we did a 5-year research using, working with the University of Florida State University. We did 5 years of research looking at the number of murders that took place in our community. What are the common denominators of murders that take place in a community? We called it the anatomy of a homicide. And from that research that we did, we came away with these, what I believe are nuggets. First, we found that about 90% of the kids who were involved in murders, either the victim or the perpetrator, had been expelled from school. Secondly, we found that the same number or thereabout were either placed in an alternative school or had 20 or more contacts with the school in an adverse situation long before they were expelled or placed in an alternative school. And so from that data, we are now in the process of working with both our county and city governments to set up what we are calling a council on the status of men and boys. The idea here being that we understand from the research that we did that we have to do something specifically in 3 areas. One, the number of children who come to school with some real struggles as relates to 3rd grade reading levels. The second thing as I just spoke of, the second thing is the number of kids who are expelled from schools. And then lastly, the number of kids who are placed in alternative schools. We know that those 3 populations account for more than 50% of the persons who are involved in violent crime in our communities. And given that reality, what we've done is establish this Council for the Status of Men and Boys, where we will now sit down and specifically look at the number of children in our community, some 2,000 or so, that have those adverse childhood experiences. And now as an entire community, we will work towards making sure that we bring those social service organizations. We work with, as I said, Florida State University. We have a 5-step, what I call dosing plan, where we actually sit down with these families and talk about what those problems are, then bring the clinicians in and work with those families on an ongoing basis. We believe that that's perhaps, I believe, and certainly my staff does, that this is replicatable across the country, and it'll be something that we'll be looking to bring back to you all at some point. We get some more data and some more information about where we are. But let me just simply close by saying that much of the information that Mr. Attorney David talked about and Chief Lanier talked about are some of the things we're doing here in Tallahassee, Leon County as well. Obviously, one of the first things I did, I served as the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. In that capacity, we went around the country and around the world, focused on making sure that suicides by police officers during my years of 2012 was perhaps the leading cause of death by police officers. We believe that still to be extremely high. Of course, this past year or so, COVID became the #1 killer of law enforcement officers. But I also believe that we need to continue to work with our police officers, our deputies, and trying to make sure that we have resilience within our ranks, that we have a focus on not only those adverse childhood experiences that our children are experiencing, but also adverse day-to-day experiences that our police officers are engaged in, so that we continue to drive down not only crime, but create an environment where our deputies and our police officers can function more effectively in the environments that we placed in. Again, thank you all for giving me the opportunity to come on here and share some of the things we're doing in Leon County.
Thank you, Sheriff McNeil, and very nice to meet you virtually today. And we're going to hold you to that about presenting about a replicatable model, right,
Oh,
sir?
absolutely.
Okay. And I love the idea of the televisits using the library. That's just inspiring work. Thank you so much. And thank you for your leadership as well within your own department and reaching out to create resilience among your officers. All right, we're going to introduce our last panelist right now, Dr. Stephanie Covington. She is internationally recognized clinician, author, lecturer, organizational consultant with over 35 years of experience. I was pleased to have Dr. Covington as a keynote speaker. When I worked in healthcare at Ballad Health, she was one of our keynote speakers at our ACE Aware conference, and since then has become a wonderful friend. I like to call her a brand in this business. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Covington. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Becky. And I'm going to talk as quickly as I can. When I think about trauma work, I think about trauma work on 3 levels. Trauma informed is what we need to know. Trauma responsive is what we need to do. And we've certainly been hearing about that on multiple levels. Trauma specific is what we need to provide. So I'm going to talk about these 3 levels, basically through the lens of jails, prisons, or custodial settings. And of course, we see trauma impacted people everywhere. And we've seen some of this mentioned, but there's some things unique to the justice system. We see people who are justice involved that have the highest rates of abuse and trauma. We know that childhood abuse is linked to adolescent and adult criminal behavior, but then the experience itself of the criminal justice system, because of the structures, the policies, and the procedures, traumatize or re-traumatize people. And very important, because we know trauma impacts thinking, feeling, and behavior, 3 things that the justice system is focused on. So if we look at the process of trauma, which is the same for people in or out of the justice system, until we get to this fourth part that says psychological or physical distress. And this is where there are current stressors. The current stressor could be being arrested, being incarcerated, or having a trigger or an activator that reminds you of the trauma. And when a trauma survivor is activated by a sight, a sound, a smell, they're pushed back in time and they're flooded by feelings that belong to the traumatic event. The criminal justice system has triggers built into it. The restraints, the handcuffs, the isolation, the patent cavity searches, loud noises, yelling, threats, all the things that happen in the system, in a system that was designed for victimizers, but actually people in the justice system were victims before they ever were victimizers. And we can just see a scenario here of what could happen in a carceral setting. You have a person who experiences trauma, the brain and body become overwhelmed, their nervous system is unable to return to equilibrium, and the trauma goes untreated, which is true for most justice involved people. So the person stays in a stress response mode. Cues then trigger and activate the trauma response, the loud noises, searches, cell extraction, and the person reacts to the trauma cues from a state of fear. So you can see within custodial settings how risky this is, both for the residents there as well as for staff. And we can see what kind of responses, and these are things we have certainly learned and is being reinforced from the ACE study. We have the retreat responses that are the mental health responses. And yet we have mental health services in the justice system that are not provided through the lens of trauma. Substance use disorder. We've criminalized addiction. And yet the treatment that we often provide in the justice system is not integrated treatment with trauma. The deliberate self-harm that's particularly challenging in a custodial setting. Suicide attempts. And then we have the harmful behavior to others, the aggression, violence, and rages. Again, programming is often provided, has nothing to do with trauma. And so basically that's where my work comes in. I develop programs to deal with those various issues. And again, we've talked about the ACE study. This was done a number of years ago, women in prison. Not a surprise. Most of them, majority of them had a score of 4 or more. And they were the women who were having the physical and mental health problems. But a score of 7 or more yeses indicated a 980% greater risk of having mental health problems. And we know that our prisons have become the mental health system for people who are marginalized in our society. And yet we're not talking about trauma. So it's really important as we talk about trauma that we consider gender. And you'll notice several of the panelists have mentioned something for men and boys or a school for girls, because what we know is there are differences in trauma. There are gender differences. And so, for example, in childhood, boys and girls are at risk, particularly from family members, people they know. We see the difference when we look over the lifespan. So for a young man, his greatest risk for harm comes from people who dislike or hate him, peers, police. It particularly happens if it's a young man who's gay or a young man of color, a young man who's transitioning, or perhaps a gang member. For the young woman, her greatest risk for harm comes from the person to whom she's saying, I love you. If we look in adult life, if a man serving in the military, his greatest risk is from the enemy. If he's living in the free world in our communities, greatest risk being a victim of crime committed by a stranger. The woman who serves in the military, greatest harm comes from those she's serving with, and she lives in our communities. It's from the person to whom she says, I love you. And then the LGBTQ population, gender nonconforming people in our society are at the greatest risk of harm, both in the community and in the criminal justice system. When we look at youth, we talk about a school to prison pipeline. Actually, that's about boys. Girls It's the sexual assault to prison pipeline. And so this is why risk and response to trauma has a gender difference to it. And so our response, we have to take gender into consideration. And the gender issues are becoming more complex in custodial settings. This is because we're beginning to acknowledge the transgender and non-binary population that we have in a system that was set up by a binary system that doesn't work for everybody. You know, what do people really need to know? We talk about being gender responsive. Staff and the people we see need to know exactly the same information, understanding the process of trauma, including gender differences, learning about common reactions, developing coping skills. When we teach people about trauma, you'll hear them say things like post-traumatic stress. Oh, you mean people know about this? I've been hiding this for years. I just thought I was crazy. So we have training. This is material that you can use on your own, or we can train with you. It's trauma training through the lens of corrections. There's an adult version, and there's one with a focus on youth. So trauma responsive was the second piece I mentioned. And we heard a lot about different, the district attorney, the police becoming trauma responsive. They're taking what they know and putting it into action. And this is the piece that often gets missed in a lot of jurisdictions. It means you really have to review your policies and practices through the lens of trauma, with the expectation then that the behavior of correctional officers, counselors, all staff will reflect your new policies and practices. And moving from trauma-informed to trauma responsive usually needs a very structured and guided process, because we're really talking about organizational change. We're talking about the culture environment. So it involves multiple steps, multiple levels, requires a commitment of leadership over time. Certainly we heard this from the panelists. And it's based on 5 basic core values. Sandy Bloom, Dr. Bloom and I developed materials to help organizations do this. This is material you can use on your own for organizational change. It has a way of doing helping you do a self-assessment, an implementation plan, things to help, as I said, with this change process. And then there are trauma-focused interventions, the things we actually use with people involved in the justice system. And so I'll share with you some of these. There's helping women recover and helping men recover. This is integrated programming. The focus is on treating addiction, but it also has the lens of trauma. This material has become the new cornerstone of the new substance use treatment programs in the California system, where we have 35 prisons. There's a criminal justice version and a community version of the materials, and the materials are also available in Spanish. Research that was originally done on helping women recover. This was a randomized control study. We were able to follow the women 12 months into the community. We found that we reduced recidivism. There was a randomized control study, treatment as usual, or a gender responsive treatment using materials for women. We decreased recidivism by 67%, significantly difference in the reduction in the drug use, and they're continuing into treatment when they left the prison and went into treatment in the community. We have programming for youth, Voices for Girls, A Young Man's Guide to Self-Mastery for Boys. We use this with adolescents. We're also using it with transitional age youth. It's an integrated program in that there is information on substance use, trauma, but it's also really about also sense of self, relationship, communications, building resilience. This is a trauma-specific material. Beyond Violence was developed for women who commit violent, aggressive crimes. The community version is Beyond Anger and Violence. And this works with women on both the violence they've experienced as well as the violence they have perpetrated. We have we have lots of research on this. This is just one randomized control study. You'll see improved mental health in the Beyond Violence group, less anger and less aggression. In a different jurisdiction, we were able to follow the women a year post-release. They were either in the Beyond Violence group or in the assaultive offender program that was written for men, called gender neutral, but actually a men's program. And it was twice as long. And you'll see that the difference in their arrest rate after the first year, significant decrease with Beyond Violence and also positive drug screen. Our newest material on trauma is Healing Trauma for Women and Gender Diverse People, and also Exploring Trauma and Intervention for Men and Gender Diverse People. These are 6-session programs, so they're very brief. We have a lot of robust research on this, and this in California, we're able to lead this as a peer-led program, and we've been running these programs for a number of years. This is one of our graduating classes. Like I said, we probably now have over 4,000 women have been in this program. We have 1,000 in the research. Decrease in mental health, increase in social connection and emotional regulation. For the men, we probably have over 6,000 participants by now. Again, over 1,000 in research. You'll see the mental health and aggression. Talking so fast, I can't catch up on my own words. But anyway, we have a decrease in the mental health symptoms, their anger and aggression, and increase again in social connection and emotional regulation. We also use these programs in our secured housing unit. This is one of our graduating classes from the secured housing unit, and 2 of our graduating classes from the men's secured housing unit. So we've been able, and the materials are used in lots of jurisdictions in this country, other countries. And in the UK, we're working with 17 men's prisons, long-term high security, and all of the 12 women's prisons. Resources, program materials, you'll find on my website. There's a bookstore. All of the research studies are posted in the research section on the website. I think from our panel, you really understand that when the criminal justice system becomes trauma-informed and trauma-responsive, organizations and facilities become safer. Staff and those receiving services feel safer, staff jobs become easier, and all programming becomes more effective. I think it's essential that we realize the centrality of both trauma and gender throughout the justice system when we're talking about policing, courts, community corrections, and the carceral settings, that these are really important considerations if in fact we want to have an impact, a positive impact, and helping people make transformative change in their lives. So thank you very much. And that's contact information, and I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you, Stephanie, Chief, District Attorney David, Sheriff McNeil, Becky, for being an excellent moderator. That this whole panel was so wonderful and so rich with information. Unfortunately, it was so rich that we unfortunately have to bypass a lot of the Q&A that we had planned to make sure that we are able to get to in full our second session panel on the youth who are transitioning from systems involvement. And so we really think that this entire workshop session is going to come together and be an excellent resource for folks and advocates. There are so many ways and so much activity in the chat about how can we reach out to the various stakeholders that we need to, and you all help paint a picture as to how we can do that. I want to pass it over to the Share Your Story for this segment. Bill Mazur is a former deputy chief with the Atlantic City Police Department and now works for Acadia Healthcare, supporting first responders as well as veterans who are struggling with mental health and well-being. And so, Bill, I pass it over to you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jess. I really appreciate that. Wow, what a panel. No pressure here to bring it home, right, as the closer, but I'll do my best to because there's definitely, I mean, there is a commonality and our messages are aligned for every presenter. So kudos to everybody. As Jess mentioned, I'm a former career law enforcement official, spent 25 years in the profession, did it my whole entire adult life. I'm a second generation police officer too. My father spent 40 years in law enforcement, as well as one of my brothers. The rest of my family was in some form of public service, if you will, education and medicine. So that's where I kind of get the, this is in my DNA type of thing. And so having spent 25 years in law enforcement, having a front row seat to trauma, that's where my, if you want to call it, my level of expertise, if you will, comes from. I'm not a clinician or a doctor, nor do I purport to be, but I have a very good understanding from real life experiences how trauma impacts you, repetitive exposures to trauma, how it, the physiological impact, and then of course how it drives behavior. And the majority of my experiences come from a career in law enforcement. As just mentioned, when I left law enforcement, I went to work in the behavioral health care field. And what I do is I work on a national team of about 60 folks who triage all types of behavioral health care issues and connect people to resources for substance use and mental health issues. I happen to have a subspecialty in first responder families. So that's what I do. I work on a team that just does specifically first responders. So I have this sort of niche experience that I want to share with you today. So this is what I'm about to show you. It's just a few slides. It's about a conversation. I have a couple of statistics I want to throw up on the screen here, and they'll be available to anybody who'd like them afterwards. But I like to cite these things and for you to actually have a visual reference when I'm talking about it. So a couple of questions that come up, and of course, an extension of this conversation is, how does trauma, substance use, mental health issues, possibly post-traumatic stress, how does that all sort of thread into the first responder world? Well, let's take a look at it and kick it into gear. So let's look at first statistically, how many police officers actually full-time exist in the United States. Depending upon where you look, it's about 800,000 to 850,000 police officers full-time sworn, and that covers local, state, county, federal, right? So what the statistics say, and this is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and a survey done through a well-known law enforcement publication, it showed that 20 to 25% of active police officers were struggling with a chemical dependency, right? So that math translates into about 200,000 police officers struggling with an addiction. Usually that addiction is alcohol or some other type of substance use. And I can say through my experience in 25 years in law enforcement, I think the chief and the sheriff would back me up on this, and probably the DA. What I would say is that it's probably a conservative estimate. And I say this not just through my personal experience on the job, but now working nationally and triaging dozens of these cases per week. And you see that it's the most accepted socially, of course, the most socially accepted form of coping skill, albeit a maladaptive coping skill, an unhealthy coping skill. It is the most socially accepted and reinforced through the eyes of the subculture that exists in the first responder world. Why is it? It's a way to deal with trauma, right? It's a way to numb sort of those traumatic experiences or those lasting impacts you're having from those traumatic events. And we're seeing it nationwide. If we go to the next slide, the outlook is very similar for the subcategories of first responders: fire service, EMTs, dispatchers. Roughly what these statistics say is that there's another 2 million of these folks walking around, right? If you apply those same statistical analysis numbers, you'll see that there's well over 500,000 first responders struggling with a substance use issue. Now, here's what we see in our behavioral healthcare world, and I think that the docs and the clinicians will agree with me when I say this, that substance use, largely substance use addiction, process addiction, these are generally symptomatic. What does that mean? Well, there's typically trauma beneath that. And the substance use or the process addiction is a coping skill for the undiagnosed or untreated mental health issues that they're experiencing. If you go to the next slide, here's another survey. And of course, the numbers speak for themselves. This was done by the University of Phoenix, large-scale survey nationally with first responders. And so the first statistic, again, I think these are probably conservative numbers based on what I see here. 85% of first responders have experienced a significant traumatic event, a big T, right? A big trauma, what we call in this business. A big T is a, we're talking about not just the usual sort of bad thing that happens. We're talking about people losing their lives either through an active shooter situation, severe abuse through victims, vicarious trauma, watching an officer get shot. We're talking about big traumatic events, responding to fatal accidents. 85% of first responders have experienced this, either a singular traumatic event or an ongoing repetitive exposure throughout a 10 or 20-year career. Now, the next two are really the ones that have us sort of, gravely concerned for this demographic. And the next one is 55% of those folks feel that if they report this or go to a supervisor, the supervisor would look at them differently, perhaps see them as weak. Whether it's real, whether it's reality-based is irrelevant. It's what they're feeling at that moment, right? The next one, 69% of those folks said that mental health services, although they know that they exist, they're seldom or never utilized. The last statistic you see there in that slide is a general sort of statistic, and that's from SAMHSA. 1 in 5 families will experience a mental health crisis. Now, I can tell you that statistic was first put out. That was pre-COVID. I would venture to say that there's at least a 100% increase in that, maybe 2 out of 5 families, maybe more, based on what we've been through as a society, a culture, a nation with COVID, right? The general physical and civil unrest, the uncertainty that COVID has brought, the political uncertainty, the distrust that has developed amongst Americans. So I would say that has to inevitably have increased, right? So when you look at these statistics, there's really one logical thing that can be gleaned from that, which we'll see on the next slide. The conclusion to these statistics is that shame and stigma holds people back from seeking help. That's it, plain and simple. And that's really what we're trying to change here. We're trying to change what we call the operational vernacular, right? The language that we use, not just in society, but in the subculture of the first responder demographic. We're trying to normalize or bring some normality to this conversation about changing language. Because when you change language, you can change thought processes. When you change thought process, you can change perspectives, right? And that comes down to empathy, gaining empathy for self and others. And that's really where the ACEs and trauma-informed policing make such a huge difference with policing approaches. When you gain empathy, you have to have understanding, self-awareness for self in order to develop self-management skills, adaptive coping skills, or else how in the world could you extend that to the community that you're policing in, right? So you have to have this understanding of self. What I will say is there is some good news in this, and we'll go to that in the next slide, which is really the closing side. What can leaders do? And when I use the term leadership, I think most, if not everybody, would agree with me. I'm not talking about positional leaders. I'm not necessarily talking about chiefs or sheriffs or DAs or CEOs. While top-down enforcement of this or belief or reinforcement of it is absolutely essential, when we talk about leadership, it's not positional leadership. Everyone holds a leadership role. And these slides really illustrate that point. There was another survey done by the IACP, large-scale survey, and they talked about how to change the operational vernacular. How can people feel more comfortable coming forward? And if you look in those 3 boxes that we have on the slide, the survey found that first responders will be more open to getting help in 2 areas. Number 1, if the leader or somebody in a leadership position, maybe a positional leadership position, if somebody talked about their experience or just showed empathy toward this sort of trauma-informed model, there was a 71% increase or 71% chance that the person would have a higher comfort level in speaking about this. Here's the better news in the last block. It's even higher for peers. In other words, people who didn't hold positional power, or positional leadership. So it wasn't a lieutenant, a captain, a deputy chief, a chief, or a sheriff. It was a line officer. And when they spoke about it, they felt even more supported, which was 83% of those first responders polled said that they would feel comfortable going and asking for help. What does this mean? Again, I'll bring it back to a very, very simple sort of hypothesis. It's language. It is having a conversation, which is really what we're doing here today. Yes, all of the people on this program, I would be presumptuous to say probably 100% of the people on this call agree, because we're all into this, right? It's our job now to bring this conversation externally out there into the communities, into our organizations, because here's what I can tell you. Over the last 4 years serving in this role as a public safety liaison, our team has helped well over 1,500 first responder families, well over. We're moving toward 2,000 in 4 years' time, connect them to resources. And I can tell you absolutely without any modicum of hesitation, every single one of those cases started with a conversation, which is exactly what we're doing here today. So language matters, the conversations matter, and that's really where I'd like to bring this in for a landing. This is obviously a highly condensed version of a much more layered contextual conversation and presentation that we do, but I was so happy to be able to share just these few slides with you, and I hope that you found value in this message. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks to everybody in this first panel. It was such a valuable conversation about the work that is possible and is being done in the justice system. Because of the time, I know that generally we play a little bit of music and have a little bit of a longer break, but instead what we're going to do is turn to my handy dandy book of brain breaks, and we invite everybody in the audience, before we go into our panel on youth transitioning out of the foster care and child welfare system, to engage in 2 brain breaks. So the first one is really a calming brain break, and the other one is a little bit of a focusing brain break, just 2 things that we can do throughout the day. And then we'll get right into the second panel. So that way we don't lose the valuable conversation that will undoubtedly happen in just a few minutes. So the first one you may have heard is called box breathing. We're just going to inhale and exhale along with a box. So we're going to breathe in through our nose for a count of 4. And then we're going to hold our breath for 4 seconds. And then we're going to exhale for a count of 4. And then we're going to hold that for 4 seconds. And we'll do that twice. All right. So inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. And hold, 1, 2, 3, 4. And one more time. Inhale, hold, exhale, and hold. And then the second brain break that will get us into a little bit more, hopefully that helped to calm us down. These are good grounding exercises that we can do at any time. For a little bit more of that focus exercise, a brain break called Scissor Wings, which if we put our fingers next to our eyes here like this, we are going to wink with our left and close our right scissors, and then switch. And on your own time, you'll just try to switch and close an opposite eye and finger. It may look a little bit funny. You'll notice that my mouth also shifts with whichever eye I am winking with. It's just a little bit of a helpful hint or exercise to get our brains to just recenter. So I always like going with a calming exercise and then a focus exercise. And like that showed us, that took about 2 or 3 minutes and can get us back into a little bit more of a rejuvenated state. But without further ado, we have a fantastic second panel as well to continue this wonderful day of the workshop series. And so I want to turn it over to Karen Johnson from Social Current to introduce that panel. So Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Jesse. Oh man, now I'm like, wait a minute, I want to practice this a little longer, this scissor thing, to see if I can even get close. Something to do later today. So thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks so much to our first panel. What a wonderful sharing of knowledge and expertise, and really so many hopeful messages there that we can learn about how we can increase and strengthen and align our services in criminal justice with trauma-informed approaches. So I have been privileged to work with and learn from youth who have transitioned out of care through my work in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And that's what our panel is about today. And I've also been privileged to work with organizations, systems, and communities striving to advance all we have been talking about in these sessions: trauma-informed, resilience-oriented, healing-centered approaches. And my experience tells me, and I firmly believe this, that it is within our reach to partner with all of our stakeholders, including, most importantly, our foster youth who are transitioning to adulthood, to make things better for our youth, to close the gaps in supports and services for this group of extraordinary individuals. We know approximately 22,000 youth find themselves aging out of care every year, which from one perspective is way too large of a number. Even one youth who faces these circumstances, it's not okay. And from another perspective, it's a pretty doable number. We can do this. We can mobilize all the research, the expertise, the resources, the commitments that we all have, the passion we have, and we can partner and co-create with our youth, our families, and our communities to meet this challenge, to ensure every former foster youth has what they need to thrive as they navigate early childhood, early adulthood, and beyond. So today we are really privileged to have excellent speakers. Denny showed this previously, this slide previously today, but this is our group of speakers and panelists this afternoon. And this group of individuals really all bring different experiences, knowledge, and points of view, and they can help us. They can talk with us about what we can do to move this needle in this critical and urgent areas of work. I am playing a very small role, the moderator, kind of the person who connects the different pieces of the session. So to start us off today, I'm privileged to introduce Carrie Richmond. Carrie Richmond is a passionate advocate for children and families in both her personal and professional life. She is the American Academy of Pediatrics' first ever manager of child welfare policy. Carrie also serves as the executive director of Foster Strong, a nonprofit comprised entirely of alumni of the foster care system and dedicated to using storytelling to change the negative narrative surrounding foster care. Carrie Richmond has also given a TEDx talk on her foster care experience. So we're really excited you're here with us today, Carrie, and I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm joining you all from Washington, D.C., where it has been raining for like 2 days straight, so kind of dreary. So this is a bright piece of the day. As Karen shared, I wear a few different hats in my day-to-day work. One of them is at the American Academy of Pediatrics, doing child welfare policy work, and really just amazing to work with pediatricians who care deeply about kids and families. And the other hat I get to wear is leading Foster Strong, which we are still sort of a baby organization. We really were founded following the movie Instant Family. If any of you have seen that cute family comedy with Mark Wahlberg and Octavia Spencer, it's about a family who is fostering to adopt. So following that movie, our organization was founded to continue changing the narrative surrounding foster care. And our team does that by sharing our own stories of moving from trauma to triumph. And we do that through a podcast where we have other former foster youth join and share their insights, and also through other platforms just centered in storytelling and really encouraging other young people and other alumni to authentically own their stories. But there's a lot more to me, obviously, than just my day jobs. I'm also the daughter of a mother who struggled with a mental health diagnosis and was deemed unfit to parent before I was ever even in the world. I am the daughter of a father who lost his dad at a really young age, had an alcoholic mother, experienced his own abuse, and struggled with his own drug and alcohol addiction throughout his life. And I am the granddaughter of a Filipino woman who immigrated to America as a single mother of 5 after seeing her entire family be slaughtered in the Philippines in World War II. So I'm Filipino, I am a former foster youth, and I have complex PTSD. And these are identities that I have wrestled with throughout my life, but can now own fully. And I think that trauma runs not only through my bloodline, but in my DNA. There's that generational trauma, but I didn't really know a lot or understand a lot about trauma until a few years ago. And I had just lost somebody I was close to, and I was walking through a bookstore and just really struggling with the grieving process. And this book kind of popped off the shelf at me, and maybe some of you have read it. It's called The Transformation, and it's discovering wholeness and healing after trauma. And there is something about it that just pulled me in. And when I started reading the book, I was like, holy moly, this is so much of what I've experienced in my life, but I've never been able to put words to. I knew I had a rough childhood. I knew mine looked a lot different than most kids I grew up with, but I had no idea how much trauma had impacted who I was, the way I showed up in the world, and also the way that my family was and the things that had happened to us. So it really helped me to have a new understanding of who I was and to feel validated in my experiences, but also helped me to look at my family in a new light and to have compassion and grace for their shortcomings and for the experiences that led to my removal. I was so grateful to have this language and to finally be able to put into words all of these things. And it made me wonder how my parents' life would have played out if they had that language, and if they were able to safely explore the trauma that they had experienced, and if they were given the tools to be able to heal and build resilience. So as I was preparing for today, I was thinking about how we're so close to coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic, and just thinking about the toll that it's taken on all of us. It has clearly impacted mental health across the country. And that's why last year, the American Academy of Pediatrics declared a national state of emergency on children and teens' mental health. And this already existing crisis has been compounded by not only the pandemic, but the ongoing struggle for racial justice and some of the existing trends that were already playing out prior to 2020. So we've had a serious mental health crisis in our country for decades, but the past 2 years, children and families have experienced enormous adversity and disruption. And for our foster care population, this is only exacerbated. And especially for the group that we're talking about here on this panel, our transition-aged youth, who often leave the system with no networks of support or family. I think in the past decade, we've really made critical shifts in the conversation around mental health and trauma. Like, for instance, we're actually having the conversation. And we're making important shifts to better understand trauma and the long-term impacts it has on our emotional, physical, and mental health. And we're also starting to see more prioritization around prevention efforts. And child welfare policies, states are in the process of implementing the Family First Prevention Services Act, which will support families and help them stay safely together and prevent family separation. And this is progress that is worthy of being celebrated. But when it comes to supporting transition-aged youth with the services they need to heal and thrive, we still have a ways to go. Our young people in foster care often have high amounts of adverse childhood experiences. And while we know that trauma often happens before removal, we don't really acknowledge enough that it also happens at removal from our families of origin, and that foster care often adds to the already existing traumas we've experienced. So as we look to shift from a foster care system that further traumatizes children to one that supports the healing, growth, and development of young people, we have to include the voices and expertise of those who have experienced the system firsthand. We have to stop and ask these people what it is they need and actually listen and respond, because the services that they say they need will be the ones that are most responsive. At Foster Strong, we talk a lot about resilience, and one of our mottos is unbelievably resilient. That's a message that we want to spread to young people and let them know that they are unbelievably resilient. But we also want to be careful about how we talk about resilience, that we're not putting undue pressure on people, that they have to fake it or show up in a certain way, not make them think that resilience is doing it all alone and having to be completely independent. And for me, I believe resilience is standing in the truth of our experiences, but not being overcome by them. And what I've learned as we've had these conversations about resilience, and as I've worked closely with the pediatricians at the American Academy of Pediatrics, is that, and also from my own experiences in childhood, is that the foundation of building resilience is really safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. So today you're going to hear from the panel about a lot of incredible services and strategies to support transition-aged youth. But what I want you to notice as I talk is that common theme of connection. Healthy relationships are truly the superfood to resilience and the antidote to trauma. And the language that we use matters, and the conversations that are taking place throughout these workshops are crucial. But as we leave today's panel, I encourage you to pause and ask yourselves, how am I, or can I, contribute to my own resilience and the resilience of my community? I love this quote that I stumbled across a couple years ago that says something along the lines that trauma continues to travel through our family lineages until someone does the hard work of healing it. But what I would add to that is that it's not a one-person job. It takes a community, and it takes connectedness to wrap around a person and break the chains of generational trauma. And the panel you are hearing from today are absolutely chain breakers in their community and across this country. And I hope that you're as excited as I am to learn from them today. So thank you, and I will pass it back over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you for that message, asking the questions that we need to consider and helping us to think about the supports that will lead to wholeness and healing for our youth. So thank you so much. And now I'm privileged to introduce our panel facilitator today, who is Rashawn Bennett. And Rashawn is the Director of Operations at the National Youth Employment Coalition. And in his role, he helps lead a national effort that decreases the number of young adults identified as out of school or out of work, which we know as opportunity youth. Over the past years, he has worked to improve the capacity of workforce providers around the country to better serve youth. And he has led national advocacy efforts to increase federal investments in youth workforce development. So thank you so much, Rashawn, for taking it from here with our excellent panel.
All right. And thank you, Karen, and thank you, Carrie. Before we get into the panel, I want to describe some of our chain breakers that's on the panel. We'll start with Michelle Grimes. Michelle Grimes is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a master's degree in child development. She brings over 14 years of experience in the child welfare field in regards to training and supervising therapists in foster care settings to provide trauma-informed, strength-based, and culturally responsive counseling services in home, community, and school settings. Currently, she is the Director of Counseling at Youth Guidance in Chicago, Illinois. We'll then hear from Sixto Cancel. Sixto is the CEO and founder of Think of Us. Think of Us operates as a research development lab for child welfare, transforming the system so that people with lived experiences are at the center of designing, imagining, and building. Sixto grew up in and aged out of the child welfare system. His personal life experience has powered a passion to transform the child welfare system so that every person has the conditions they need to heal, develop, and thrive. Third, we'll hear from Tim Grove. Tim is a senior consultant at WellPoint Care Network, a human services agency whose mission is to facilitate equity, learning, healing, and wellness for all. He brings over 25 years of professional experience in a variety of direct care, administrative, and executive positions, including leading WellPoint's trauma-informed care initiatives. His framework has been used to train more than 60,000 people from diverse disciplines over the past 15 years. And last but not least, we will hear from Jasmine Snell. Jasmine currently works as a data specialist at the Chattanooga Regional Homeless Coalition. Jasmine uses her expertise to influence policy reformation within the child welfare system as a Jim Casey Young Fellow within the Annie Casey Foundation. Work she believes serves to abolish discriminatory and unjust policies within the child welfare, juvenile justice, and thus criminal justice systems. Jasmine enjoys giving back to youth through mentorship and is passionate about improving the outcomes for youth and families. All right, and just a reminder for folks to leave questions in the Q&A part. We're going to save a couple of minutes at the end for that, but I'm just going to kick it off with just, because I'm nosy, a little bit of a mental health check-in and well-being. I would love to know the panelists, like how you doing and everything, and then if you can describe kind of the work that you're doing and why it's important for the trauma-informed movement. So I'll start and I'll be really, really brief. I'm doing well. Today's been a really good day. This week has been kind of tough in the beginning, but it's turned out at the end to be really, really great. And I'm just so excited to be moderating this panel. So mental health is doing good today. So I'm really happy about that. And why this is important to me is that from my organization, we already know that the workforce system is broken for lots of folks in this country. And so what we really need is a systemic and coordinated response to really help those who are most marginalized, and frequently those are folks who are transitioning from the child welfare system, get connected to work and opportunities more broadly. So that's that. I'm gonna kick it off to Michelle. So again, just a little mental health check-in, and then tell us about the work you're doing and why this movement is important to your work.
Thank you, Rashawn, and hi everyone. I'm happy to be here. Mental health check-in. Happy it's Friday. Yesterday was my birthday, so I'm feeling good about that. I've got some celebration happening this weekend. And yeah, overall, things are good for the middle of winter in Chicago. We'll put that caveat in there. So as Rashawn mentioned, I am the Director of Counseling and Strive at Youth Guidance in Chicago, Illinois. For the past 14 years, I've been working really in a mix of foster care settings and school-based settings, and a lot of the time kind of a meeting in the middle between the two. So I have seen a lot of how our young people get lost and left behind, and their needs get missed as they get close to aging out of the system. That work, I mean, I can't take enough time to say why it's important to talk about this regarding youth and care specifically. There are so many reasons, but I think the primary one that comes to mind for me is just really minimizing the vulnerability that comes along with being an adolescent moving into young adulthood, in an education system, trying to figure out college, trying to figure out career, without consistent, stable adult support a lot of the time. And I think, as Rashawn said, the workforce is failing in many ways. And I think this is one of the largest ways that we are failing our young people in the US is really having systems that support and recognize the impact of trauma, recognize the impact of varied life experience, and can still find strengths among our youth and give them the supports they need to really thrive beyond involvement in the system. I've just seen so many young people turn 21 and not have a viable housing plan, let alone being able to think about college or career. And we all know that housing stability has to come first to really be able to succeed in moving toward, consistent employment and independent living. So that's the short story of why I'm here and why I feel like this is so important. I really want to see a stronger, more sustainable plan for this particular age group.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think that's a great segue to Sixto, whose organization touches so many youth throughout the country. Same question, you Sixto, quick mental health check-in, and then tell us about the work that you're doing and why this movement is important to your work.
Thank you. I'll be authentic to say my heart is a little heavy as I, lost a dear friend because of the lack of mental health support that person had needed. And so I felt like today's conversation was just so timely as we are leading into this work. The reason why this is important to me is because I truly believe that right now our child welfare system is just not structured to actually enable enough healing, and that there is a lot of system-induced trauma that we can be able to kind of course correct. And so that's the thing that makes me most excited about having this conversation, being in this room, is about how do we not just talk about what is trauma and kind of the ways to address it, but really how do we start to move to embed healing as part of the process, right? And how does the system actually get re-architected a bit so that we are able to go ahead and have the individuals who are impacted by a system actually experience healing. And it's not in spite of the system or in spite of the situation that you get to your destination, but it's because of the actual structure of a system that you experience healing. And I don't believe that that's what our system is set up to do today.
Thank you, Sixto, and thank you for sharing that. If you need to take some time, to do whatever, I'm sorry to hear about the news, but thank you for being here with us today. So let's transition over to Tim. Same question.
Thanks, Rashawn. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's see. I think the most honest answer is fair to Midland. At least to my mind, that best captures my mental health in the moment. And the reason that I think I'm here is I really stand on the shoulders of a few thousand youth we serve on a daily basis. A number of partners we've been on this trauma-informed journey with, and about 400 WellPoint staff who kind of have a both and approach to this. So what I mean by that is part of what we've done is we've worked to transform child welfare systems. And just to give a brief glimpse into that, a number of years ago, we asked an audacious question. Could we genuinely get all of our case management staff, people who work with youth and families, to a place of implementing trauma-informed practice? And honestly, if we hear Sixto's honest appraisal of our child welfare systems and Carrie's and others, that's a pretty daunting question. There are a lot of reasons to be concerned about that system. We persisted and decided to give it a try, and we discovered some pretty remarkable things. It turns out, generally speaking, you can. And it turns out when you do that with a pretty concerted push, you can get some pretty remarkable outcomes. So just to give a taste of those outcomes, and I really see this as a primary prevention strategy to prevent the need for youth to age out of the system. Twice the amount of kids in our child welfare program found permanency in the teams who initially pushed these initiatives forward, becoming trauma-informed, compared to their counterparts, double. Placement stability was significantly better, so kids and youth didn't move around as much. And more families stopped getting services from the system. And when those services stopped, they didn't need services at a future date. I said both and though, because the second part of this, and this is a bit of an ode to Karen Johnson, my dear friend and colleague, who taught us a number of years ago to keep our promise. So what Karen meant by that was just the sheer tragedy of what happens to too many youth aging out of the system. And she really rallied our community and our program and our agency to do better at keeping our promise. And there are many sort of legacies that Karen and we created that we can talk about as we go through the hour.
Great. Thank you, Tim. And last but not least, Jazz.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Jazz Snell, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm happy to be here and joining from Chattanooga, Tennessee. I also wear a few different hats as a national advocate and consultant, but today I'm here as a Jim Casey Initiative Young Fellow. Some identities I'd like to share with you all is that I am of African descent, and I lived through a continuous mental health journey. And I was brought up by a single mom of 4 daughters, and we all have coped through our lived experience with different levels of suppression. So as I learn, I feel compelled to share, and that's ultimately why I'm here today. But both my lived and professional experience has shown me the importance of uplifting and supporting the strengths of young people while they are in their natural communities and families. And this does contribute to their positive development, which includes mental health, physical health, education, employment, and other lasting sustainable things. Some work that I have been engaged in has been around race equity and focus on positive youth development. Recently, myself and a team, we were able to publish a document on how integrated positive youth development and race equity approaches across child welfare and juvenile justice systems will benefit young people long term. On the screen, you all are seeing a conceptual framework of how we feel principles of strength, which strength stands for systems integration, trustworthy and safe spaces, relationships that are positive and supportive, equity and inclusion and belonging, needs that are met holistically, growth, leadership, and opportunity to fail and learn, training and education, and then lastly, healing. So those principles make up strength. And when applied, this is a conceptual framework of it. So in the center here, we see that the young person is literally the focus and the center. And they are immediately surrounded by family and community because that's a more accurate depiction of what a young person immediate ecosystem looks like. And then further out, we have our traditional child welfare and juvenile justice systems that are still touching the young person, but they're not the first direct system. And then there is overlap between other systems like housing, health, workforce, and education. So this framework shows how each system does overlap with one another. And if they come together in a way that is integrated, we can better serve young people and contribute to their positive development. And that's all from me.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm already noticing a lot of through lines, connections, healing, systemic change from the panelists. So it's going to be good. All right, let's jump in. I want to bring in Michelle and Tim, especially on this one, but other panelists, if you want to jump in, let me know. But what are some well, Michelle from, kind of a practitioner voice, and then Tim from more of a systemic practicing voice. But the question is, what are some common myths or missteps when serving this population, especially in a trauma-informed way?
All right, everyone, couldn't find my mute button. So I pulled out two major missteps that I saw frequently, particularly when I spent several years as a therapist working with youth in the system who were 18 to 20 years old and living in independent or semi-independent living situations. Like I said, kind of getting ready to transition out of the system. And I think misstep number one was kind of seeing service providers make mistakes on both extremes. So at one end, assuming that young people who are in foster care situations and who've experienced complex and chronic trauma, assuming that they should be treated exactly like any other youth and can function and do things in all of the same ways as any other youth in a school setting, kind of forgetting the impact of trauma and the impact of all of the transitions they've made, all of the different things that have occurred because of involvement in the system. But then on the other extreme of that is also seeing service providers set really low expectations for young people and assume that they can't succeed, they can't achieve the same goals that other young people can see. And so I was trying to think through, I think I can't even really call back to which one I saw more, because I think both of those mistakes happen all the time. And I really think the answer is just becoming better listeners, paying attention to the individual you're working with, being present with each individual and recognizing that each need is unique and that each young person is going to need some extra supports, but also has resilience and has strengths that are right there on the table if you look for them. And I think all of that, the road right back to that is becoming trauma informed, really understanding the impact of trauma and how to work from a strengths-based place, but also recognize the impact of trauma. Misstep number two that I would put on the table is particularly for the young adult age group, not putting nearly enough emphasis on natural supports and not starting to seek those people out early enough for the young people who are in the system. I think there can be a lot of short-sightedness in terms of allowing youth to connect with their biological relatives, allowing youth to reach out to natural supports, even if those natural supports aren't perfect or there are difficulties there, offering services to the folks who will be in the young people's lives beyond their involvement in the system. There's a lot of things that could be done to create more stability beyond that aging out birthday that I think just get missed, get sort of overlooked in oftentimes in the name of protecting the youth or keeping them safe or making sure they don't come into harm's way. But then I think we miss some support opportunities there.
That's awesome. Tim.
Yeah, let me pick up on a couple of those threads, and I will maybe keep mine in terms of missteps focused on the ACEs study. So I had the opportunity to talk to Rob and Laura Porter not too long ago, and some of you are aware about a year or so ago, they put out an article and a video trying to describe the misuses and limitations of the ACEs study. But a lot of the missteps we've encountered, especially with young adults, is being identified by an ACE score, which first of all is not even technically accurate. And second of all is so limiting and short-sighted, even the originators of that work literally are heartbroken about that possibility. And yet we still hear language like an ACE score of 6 leads to a X for the individual. we feel a bit of an opportunity to keep putting out there the wisdom that Rob and Laura and others have shared, which is any empirical risk calculation exists at the group level, not the individual level. So from a data point of view, there are plenty of people in that group of folks with 6 or more ACE scores who will not only live a quote unquote normal life, they will live a longer than normal life. And when you think about it, making sure that message, and most people who are doing that with good intentions, but perhaps not fully informed intentions. Think about the message that can give someone sitting across the table from you. And we were part of that misstep sort of in our own evolution and history, but have tried to make a commitment to think about that differently. Point number 2, really briefly, our colleagues of color, our youth of color, any of the folks we serve who are connected to a group with a history of being disenfranchised, say things like this. So wait a minute, and you've heard a lot of this in our time together today. There's discrimination and historical trauma and poverty and inequity that creates, if you think of Dr. Wendy Ellis's pair of aces, the conditions for those adversities. If all you want to focus on are those adversities and my response, aren't we missing a big part of the picture? Aren't the solutions as much structural and societal as much as they are about what you want me to do individually? And I think once we figured out what those missteps were, we started to have much better outcomes with the youth we were trying to serve.
Yeah, that's a really great point, both of you. And a great segue to the second question, talking more about focusing on the individual and the personhood, bringing some more humanity into the equations. And this is really, I kind of want to bring in Jazz and Sixto into this, because both of you had a good parallel around healing. But the specific question is, what supports are needed to equip this population with eternal empowerment, the resilience, and navigating systems?
Jazz, I'll let you go first.
Thanks, Sixto. So yeah, there are a few supports that are needed, both supports on the young adult side and on agency side. For young adults, a few that I'll list is young people need supportive environments. So this can be their living environments, their community environments, school environments, all of that. And if they are engaged in child welfare, how can systems help change that structure so that they are more supportive and foster healing? So some concrete supports that can be in place, as Michelle mentioned, supporting those natural connections. We've passed some of the missteps, but ultimately systems are accountable to lawmakers and stakeholders in the general public and can be rather hesitant to be liable for any risky behaviors that young people take. But in order for those natural connections to be uplifted and fostered, there is a level of risk that agency must be willing to take. So supporting those natural connections, allowing funding to be used to support those natural connections is another support that is needed. And on the agency side, in order for healing to be fostered, honestly, taking a step back and thinking of our own development and transition into adulthood and lessons that we've learned ourselves and some bumps along the way, and giving that grace to young people, because there does need to be a healthy blend of accountability and responsibility, but without the ability to take risks, it blurs those lines. And Sixto, I'll pass it to you if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, when I think of some of the more practical, like what do you need as an individual? Sometimes it's first you need language to describe what you're going through. I remember as a younger teenager hearing from some folks who have been through some of the same experiences that I had been through, and being able just to hear how they describe feelings, ambiguous loss, and so forth. And so being able to name it and then being able to actually figure out how do people cope with stuff. It's the number one question that we get whenever we engage young people in a panel, a conference, is how did you cope through these things? And so there's these very intense moments, but from a systemic point, what I would say is that we need a system to re-architect itself in a way that it's not causing some of this trauma, right? So imagine you have been removed from your home, right? But then you're placed in a different home. You're told you're part of the family. You're told you're loved. You're told you're part of the you are in a safe place. But then what ends up happening is when you don't fit in or it's not working out, you do something that may be a result of your untreated trauma, and you're on to the next place. And what does that psychologically does to someone who experiences that over and over and over and over and over? And so when I think about the system, there are some common themes that we experience in it that is a result of that trauma. And I also think about this from the perspective of we're not getting enough healing opportunities within the system. So we did a participatory research study where we had 209 young people and supportive adults and staff interviewed in 5 jurisdictions. And we realized that those who had aged out could identify adults who were in their life that they were connected to, but yet when we started to dig into, but do you feel like you can rely on them for X, Y, and Z? We saw that those who had already aged out had said no. Right. And then when we backed up all to the earlier teens, they still had the ability where they were like, oh, yeah, I can ask some of these supportive adults, these adults in my life for help. And what we realized as we started to track the journey is that your social worker, your independent living coordinator started to become anchor points of relationships in your life, that when stuff started to hit the fan in your life, you would go to them. I need, clothing for a job. I need to do a resume. I need to do blank. And it's good that those type of supports were provided by a paid professional, but the trade-off was that we then didn't build the relationship between the non-paid people in your life and you didn't get enough practice of being able to rely on some of those relationships, taking some of those true bonding moments away. And so when we talk about healing, the trauma here in foster care is so rooted in relationships. It is the trauma that we all have in common. Something happened where we're no longer connected to wherever we were removed from, and now we're in a different place. And so some of the healing is rooted in being in a relationship with people who can be connected with us. But by default, the dynamics between myself and my peers and someone who's in a paid professional role is one where there is an end date. And so how do we actually start to re-architect a bit of the system to be able to go ahead and actually naturally create moments of connections with people who are going to be there lifelong that helps you inch towards the healing that we need. But the system is literally not set up to do that.
I think that's an extraordinary point. And let's not to put you on the spot anymore, but let's continue with that through line. What specific systemic either practices or policies have you found to be helpful when working with youth aging out of foster care? And after you answer that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to kind of give maybe a more local programmatic perspective on the same question.
Yeah, when I think about, so we have been over the last 15 months, we have been able to connect with over 38,000 young people where they've submitted different types of applications, complaint forms to us, and we have delegated that to 44 states. In the process of being able to collect that much data, what we've learned, like the first thing we need to be doing for folks who age out is ensure that they're not going into flight or flight mode because their housing has been jeopardized. Right? That we are able to actually support folks in meeting their basic needs. And in some places, states are cutting checks and being able to say, okay, this is your monthly allowance. And that is a policy that we see. Some places like Indiana, and I don't mean to call Indiana out, but I will today, you as a transition age young person who's above the age of 18, it's still going to the mall with a worker. We heard a young person say, I haven't bought new underwear since high school because I don't want to buy it with my worker. right? And so how do we get to develop certain skill sets if we don't even have the mechanisms to practice? And so in a state that has a policy where it's about reimbursable receipts, all of those things, it's just not set up to actually give you the stepping stones to be able to develop. And when you don't have those developmental opportunities, your sense of self and your self-worth and how you are able to build your self-esteem, how can you do that when you're being treated like such an otherism? Right? And so the otherism of being in the system and the bureaucracy that dictates our life puts us as in a corner where that is where I believe, again, another layer of what you call it, of system-induced trauma is occurring. So for me, when I think about this, what are the policies that are useful? Are the policies that enable us to have the healthy risk-taking opportunities to be able to afford an apartment, mess up with money. Like that is part of the process, people. We all have done it, right? To be able to go ahead and have those things. And then third, I think one of the projects that we're doing in Washington, it's called the Office of Adolescence. We've been co-designing this office there with the state. And how might we move away from serving the label of foster care, juvenile rehab, juvenile justice, and so forth? And how might we actually look at what is the untreated trauma that is present and that needs to move forward? What are the gaps that are there? So if you are in foster care, we can probably make an assumption there is some work to be done around parental figures, right? And parental relationships. And so like, instead of saying, here's the label I'm going to serve, how might we truly understand how we might start to serve, I fear to say the word risk factors, but the factors that create, that are a result of some of the traumas that we have experienced.
I love it, and the crowd is giving you a lot of praise in the chat. Michelle, in your line of work, directly serving youth who are aged out of foster care and other child welfare systems, what are some best practices that that you've seen successfully implemented?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sixto. It's such a poignant example, the example of the young person not wanting to buy underwear because they don't want to do that with their worker. I mean, that's so real, and something that can get missed unless you're asking the questions and looking for, okay, what's happening here? What are we missing? Anyway, so I really appreciate that. I want to call out a couple things that are working currently in youth guidance that are hopefully pointing us in the right direction. One of them is we have a really, what I think is a really essential and possibly unique, I'm not sure, program that is fully funded by DCFS, where we have master's level mental health counselors and social workers who are counselors and educational mentors, kind of as a hybrid together. This is one of the programs I oversee currently, and they work specifically in schools with young people who are in the care of DCFS to provide some school setting level mental health services, as well as academic coaching and mentoring and guiding and supporting. So they do everything from, trauma-informed counseling work to helping with college applications, taking kids on college visits, talking through resumes, connecting them with other community-based programs that can help them post high school, get through college or get to a career. They meet with caregivers as much as possible to connect with whoever is housing them, whoever's taking care of them, and help with some of the family support. And I think that program represents, to me, a lot of what needs to be done on the ground level is just finding a way to continue integrating our systems so that we don't just have a school system and a DCFS system, but so that they talk to each other and there's some mutual support there. Alongside that, youth guidance has a workforce program. Youth guidance mostly works with middle school and high school aged young people, but we have a workforce program that goes through age 24, and that exists really to be able to continue services past that high school graduation date. So the academic counseling and mentoring program feeds right into our workforce program and hopefully creates some consistency and some stability in support systems around college and career readiness and independent living readiness, which I think just circles back to one of my initial points with with the consistency of relationship that's important, that we're not just handing young people off from this person to this person to this person to this person, but that we have some folks in place who can follow our young people as they grow and develop and as their needs change, and continue with the supportive relationships with them.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. Before I move on to the next question, Jazz or Tim, did you have anything to add to that?
Not anything that has not been said. Thank you both, Sixto and Michelle, for your comments. And I will drop a resource related in the chat for folks.
Right, and that's all, Tim, thumbs up. So next question brings in both of you, Jazz and Tim, talking about the elephant still in the room. So as we emerge from, the pandemic and everything, in this space, trying to get folks, trauma informed, trying to build out best practice for people transitioning from the child welfare system. What recommendations do you have for the folks in the audience who work with this population, who care deeply about it, who are policymakers? What would you tell them?
I'll hop in, Tim. I will say the pandemic has showed us that literally anything is possible. We are able to go untraditional routes. Why we hadn't considered beforehand, I'm not sure, but it showed us what we are able to do. And when it comes to serving young people and families equitably, the sky is the limit. We are able to revise programs and how we serve folks to meet exactly what their needs are. So the pandemic itself, I'm sad it took a pandemic, but a big lesson that came out is there is flexibility. And there were risks with a lot of the measures that had to be taken during the pandemic, but we still navigated through it. So just remembering that, because young people need a sense of self-determination and agency. And the way the system currently is structured, it's just not supported for all young adults, only a select few. So that will be my key takeaway.
Yeah, Rashawn, if I could zoom up maybe to, I don't know what it would be, 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet, maybe on your question. The argument we make to policymakers all the time is basically a human capital argument. And there's a couple of ways to think about this. A lot of people in this space may not be familiar with some studies out of New Zealand called the Dunedin studies. It's worth Googling. They've done a remarkable job at sort of keeping a longitudinal cohort. And one of their core conclusions, which I suspect this audience will appreciate, is self-regulation is one of the key recipes to human capital. So for people who know quite a bit about trauma, that makes quite a bit of sense. The other argument we make is we've got to find a way. We say all the time, if only we could invest in our systems that support youth in the same way we invest in the entertainers in our society, right? So when you look at our infatuation with athletes and actors, et cetera, it's interesting. Could we not find a way to put that kind of money, resource, and priority into helping our youth? It won't solve all the problems, but it sure may help quite a bit.
Thank you. Sorry, just a reminder for the audience, we're going to have some time for some Q&A. So just put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. And then for the pandemic question, if Sixto or Michelle, if you wanted to answer that, if you had any thoughts.
Can you repeat the question?
Just recommendations as we emerge from the pandemic on just, improving the space, basically.
I mean, for the audience itself, I would say, like, and this is gonna sound too straightforward, but that's the mood I'm in. Like, don't be anybody's savior. And I really want to lean into this one. I think it's a very tough time. And I think in the moments where we get into these emergency situations, And it's been a long, almost 2 years now. We've kind of have not. I've seen some of our young people engaging with folks in a way where those boundaries are not what they used to be. It's not fair to a young person. It's not fair to the people on the front line, right? How do you enable someone to be able to go on that healing journey and support them? And I think that that is so critical in this very moment to really lean into.
Thank you. Thank you. And I pretty much just have one more question. This is for anyone to jump in, but we do want to lead with kind of an asset-based approach for folks who are transitioning out of the child welfare system. And we know that they have very unique strengths that's many times overlooked, overutilized, and sometimes even shunned. So the question is just like the intrinsic basic strengths that folks who have these experience might have. Yeah. So what are some of those strengths that they might intrinsically have? That's the question.
I can kick this one off. I think one of the most interesting things happened when we put out our cash grant opportunity to actually ask young people what were some of the things we put out. We have gotten a bucket of money during the pandemic, and I'll share my screen here. And what we were able to do with that is get applications from all over the country. We literally got 27,000 applications from current and former foster youth. And here are some of the things that they said that they needed, right? And they wrote in open-ended questions around why they needed this $1,000. And one of the most interesting things when it comes down to resilient is that you saw all these things that they were asking for, but that were identified as need. But then the thing that were the top requests were, help me get my resume together, help me get a bank account, and help me budget. And so when you see a group of 27,000 folks from all over the country, what they all had in common was they said, yes, I may be experiencing homelessness. I may be couch surfing, all of these things. I just lost my job. But they saw the solution in being able to work and get a job and being able to go on that journey. And I just thought that that was so powerful because I think that and there's all this narrative around, hey, we need to support folks and like they can't do this or you can't do that. But when it comes down to looking at from a numeric standpoint, thousands of requests being about how I can help myself in a situation. I just think that that is so wonderful. And there's a responsibility of the system and for us to be responsive to that.
Yeah, when you get a chance, yeah, please do share that data. Some folks are asking if there's like a slide or something. Great stuff. Other folks, just the strengths that this population might have. That might be overlooked.
I think the ability to, young people who have been in the foster care system know how to navigate systems in a way that, a general population 17-year-old probably has no idea of. And I always think about like, how can we harness that knowledge and that understanding of how to navigate a system, how to strategically work to get what you need from someone in whatever way that is, and how can we look at that as a strength rather than as, a young person being manipulative or playing the system or all of the kind of like icky negative phrases that get thrown around. I just think that gets missed a lot, and it really could benefit and does benefit a lot of young people in entering the workforce and going into other systems, already having an idea of like how to read people, how to tell who's going to be your ally and who's not. That's something that I would like to see more emphasis on and more training around how to utilize that strength.
Definitely, yeah, and they're our best experts for performing, said system. So yeah, it's a great point.
I was going to see if Jazz was going to jump in. Maybe I'll go quickly. So resilience is a word that, in my humble opinion, gets thrown around a little carelessly sometimes, and maybe without a full appreciation for what it means. But if I can quote another one of my favorite teachers, Dr. Bruce Perry, who argues that experience is probably the major determinant of who we are and who we become. If you think about the youth of today and what they've experienced, it has been a lot. And not just the past couple of years, but if you go back even 15 or 20 years, they have been thrown and dealt a world that I think we can all say is less than ideal. And I would argue is pretty unique in the course of human history. And what I see in response to that is an appreciation of it, but also this strong internal desire to work to make it better. It's really at risk of being a little trite or oversimplistic, but that's pretty damn remarkable. And I get inspired by that all the time when I talk to my nieces and nephews, when we talk to the young people we work with at Walt Point, and I think if anybody had a right to pack it in, it's this group of people. And by and large, the opposite is true. They want to solve problems. They want to make big change, et cetera, et cetera. That's really commendable.
Thank you. I think that's great. I think that is great. Well, very well said. I guess now, and Jazz, we're all good to keep going. Next question. Okay. Seeing the head shake. Okay. Just didn't want to leave you out in case you had something to say. We got a couple of questions, so we can transition to there. Some of them, folks can be a little bit more clear. They'll help us kind of get to your solution a little quicker. But the role of just higher ed and community colleges in helping youth transitions, is there, what can that group do better with this population? And this is open to anybody. Anyone can jump in.
I think the intentional formation of relationship on campus with peers and some folks who are there to help navigate. When we look at, Great Expectation, which is in 17 out of the 23 community colleges in Virginia, or the Guardian Scholars Program in California, which is in a lot of the community college in 4 years there, or we look at outside of foster care, Beyond 12, they all have evidence of being able to support young people achieving college. And at the core of all these different evidence-based models is relationships, that there's intentional activities around connecting folks who are in the program with each other and to the university and to adults. And so when I think about a system around healing, one place to heal is when you're trying to navigate the system. And if it wasn't achieved there, there's also the opportunity as a community college, as a four-year college, to be thinking through how do you create intentional experiences that give language to trauma, that folks are able to swap how they've been able to cope and build those support networks with each other.
Yeah. And I'd add it's important to do that relationship building for trust as well. I mean, that's crucial. Yeah.
Can I just add briefly, Rashawn? I want to give a shout out to CTIP. We had been doing some work with some technical colleges in our area. We've got a partner from Kitsap, Washington, who's done some great work with one of their technical schools. And the intersection of understanding resilience, adversity, trauma, healing, et cetera, is pretty intuitive to those facilities. There's a business argument for it. There's a social argument for it. There's a humanity argument for it. But I would argue what it needed was someone like CTIP to come along and be a bit of a coordinating glue. So those different sort of entities can connect with each other, share information. If we could get a collective increase of post-secondary retention by 10%, especially for folks who need it the most, that would be ginormous. And CTIP, I mean, I know I'm sort of pandering to the host perhaps, but CTIP's role in orchestrating that is really critical.
Yeah, we got our marching orders on that one. Great. Okay, questions are going in, so I'm going to keep going with the questions. Talking about prevention of substance use in programming, are there any specific models that you guys have found to work?
I just put this in the chat actually, but youth guidance doesn't necessarily treat substance use specifically, but of course it comes up when working with young people, and we will always aim to identify why the young person is using, how does it serve them, what purpose is it serving in their, whether it's helping them cope, helping them not feel some feelings that are difficult to feel, and try to get at that. And then of course, provide appropriate referrals to more specific services when we need to. But that's where we start with really building awareness with that young person of like, okay, is this a problem for you? What kind of negative consequences are you experiencing? And then let's look at why you're doing it. What is it doing for you? You know, there's something about this that is helping you or you wouldn't be doing it. So let's try to find some other answers there.
Yeah, I love that approach.
If I can just piggyback on that, I'll be super brief. The cutting edge of the neurobiology of trauma and addiction or misuse, we heard it referenced as the gateway drug to sort of the criminal justice system, the real gateway drug earlier. There's some really remarkable information around the neurobiology of our stress response, well beyond sort of the way it's more sort of simply taught, that suggests there's a profound functional chemical benefit to many drugs of abuse that is not intended to enable or sort of, endorse problematic behavior. But I think generally speaking, when you can approach an individual from that understanding, it just frees up the conversation and the solutions. So we get a little worried about sobriety exclusive programs if there isn't a concurrent emphasis on sort of addressing mental health. And some of the information that's out there. So Dr. Ann Rasmussen from the VA can talk about allopregnanolone as an inhibitive stress hormone. There's just some really cool cutting edge stuff out there that I think lends credence to what Michelle's describing as a means of sitting with a young person and saying, help me understand what it does for you. And then let's talk about maybe how it gets you in trouble. But if we lead with an acceptance of what it's doing for you, maybe that opens up new pathways.
That could be a whole nother panel. Tim, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot in that field that's really expanding. I think our new approach to how we approach substance use and the war on drugs and everything is really opening the Overton window to have those discussions about why and what does this drug do for you and everything. So more on that, and the people in the chat are requesting links. So maybe we'll send out some follow-up stuff around that. A quick question about does anyone have any data or just firsthand knowledge, or maybe the number of undocumented youth that are now entering the child welfare system, especially during the pandemic? I would assume it increased, but I don't have any data facts on that. Right. Great. Just moving on to the next question. Do any of the panelists have a vision of what an ideal trauma-informed, equitable, and youth-centered child welfare system looks like versus what exists today? Kind of expounded on that during the panel, but if anyone wants to jump in a little deeper on that, we have some time.
I mean, I think it's one that's rooted definitely in kin. And when kin is not possible, there are some people who are called to do this work to be fostering. There are some people who should not even spend a day fostering, right? But when you are called to do it, is amazing. It's amazing when that happens. I think one thing to pay attention to, and I know I've made this point over and over, but I'll just make it one more time for good luck here, which is how do we structure the system and how do we structure practices so that you're intentionally having those healing moments. I think, we looked about 10, 15 years ago, folks are talking about, we need to be data driven. We need to be data driven. Now the conversation is starting to say, we need to be evidence driven. It's not enough to just have data to be informed. And I kind of feel the same way with trauma. It's like, it's not enough just to know about the trauma, but then how do you actually create healing? Like, how do you enable healing? And so how do you move to a system that is one where you are experiencing healing by the very structures of just being in the system? Right now, healing is, in my opinion, is happening in spite of the system, in spite of how you have to navigate the current experiences by being committed to that system. So one where a system is truly rooted in how do you have those healing experiences so that you can be able to thrive as an adult.
And I would just briefly add, I referenced this before, but the study I mentioned that we did a number of years ago was in a public-private partnership child welfare system. So we do half of that work in Milwaukee County. And it's a longer sort of story to talk about some of the opportunities and barriers to get practice to that place. But we are one of the few entities who just got removed from a federal class action lawsuit because the majority of the lawsuit settlement items criteria were met. And many in our system would point to the role of trauma-informed practice as not the exclusive, but a key contributor to that outcome. And, I talk about that from a data point of view. That work was published in the Journal of Child Custody a couple of years ago. I think the title is Trauma Responsive Child Welfare. So, there was some empirical integrity to it, but there are literally hundreds of anecdotal stories connected to that data of kids that Sixto and Jazz and Michelle and, others describe, and youth who navigated a system that frankly could do better. And when they did better, some remarkable things happened. They went home more often. They stayed home when they went home. They sort of got out of the system to begin with. So we've had a couple of counties in our state who have done some variation of trying to replicate that work. One of those counties reduced their out-of-home care numbers by half. We think a really good outcome here is less families and kids in the system. So back to a both and, it's a system reform process and it's continuing to put some resources upstream.
I would like to, in addition to what both Tim and Sixto has added, I would like to add that I do envision a system where othering doesn't exist and we're able to see whole individuals where they are and move from the replacement model that currently leads our child welfare system. So I envision one that isn't punitive and focuses more on restoration of families, communities, cultures, and even language. And in comparison to where the system is today, we're far from that. And the main thing that sits at the forefront of my mind is how our current system practices and policies align with the vision that we have for children, families, and communities. And if we're not adequately serving everyone, there's misalignment.
Great. Yeah, thank you all for such thoughtful answers. The next question we have, and I think we have maybe 10 more minutes, but are there any models for youth peer-to-peer mental health support? And Jazz, that the framework that you put up earlier, does this, yeah, can that be included in this?
I can absolutely drop it in the chat, but a model or something that's currently happening in Tennessee. Through our state's Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, they have rolled out a certified young adult peer support specialist program. So SIAPS, pretty long acronym, but I myself am a certified peer support specialist, but it's an intensive 40-hour training. Folks who have been on a journey of recovery, a mental health journey, or just some journey of healing, after undergoing the training and getting, I believe it's 75 hours of like work in the field hours, you're qualified to then work alongside young adults who may also be on a journey of recovery, mental health, or some healing. So that's something in Tennessee. In 2021, we were the first group to go through this training, but I think it's amazing. I myself have grown as someone who lives with mental health issues, and to be able to provide sound, safe, and critical supports to other young people, I feel it's very impactful. And I can drop a link to that in the chat as well.
And Rashawn, I have a colleague from Milwaukee, hi Melanie, who just posted some information in the chat about the peer support sort of work done in our community as well. So just to lift that up.
Perfect, perfect.
And then this is not necessarily a peer-to-peer, but I just dropped a link in here. It's called Mind Right, and we've sent about 200 young people to this service and have tested it out. And we've seen some 10-week retention, 73% response rate. And this service provides a young person with 2 hours of mental health coaches, two coaches that are kind of like college age, graduate school age to a young person who is in middle high school. And it's 2 hours of just mental health coaching every single day. And so far it's starting to gain some like more than just a little bit of traction. The insurance companies are even starting to reimburse for this type of service. So I would definitely check it out. Our young people that we sent there found it useful, and the average kind of engagement is about 10 weeks.
Thank you for that, Sixto. This is it's a good question that someone posed. For folks who want to get active in this work, what pushback should they expect when trying to persuade foster care programs to adopt healing approaches or trauma-informed approaches?
I think some of the biggest pushback we've seen is that some of the activities won't align to the line item budget that the programs are responsible for. And especially if it's a federally funded contract that you're getting federal funds for, or you have to account for things in a very hour-based way. Literally the structure of the system makes it difficult for people to want to do the work. So they have to do it in addition to. I hate to be very technical, but that's like one of the biggest things that we've seen.
No, Sixto, you took the words right out of my mouth. Funding is such a barrier, especially when these systems are dependent on state and federal funding. We need to find ways to diversify funding streams so that there's some private streams as well, so that there is some wiggle room for extra training. I think that's often the issue is there is not enough budgeted, there's not enough money coming publicly to provide the amount of training that folks need on every level of a system to be trauma informed. So anyone out there who has their eyes on or has some power in some financial corners of this whole deal, keep that in mind, that that's a barrier that comes up, I would say, daily at the level where I am.
Yeah, literally federal contracts are funded in such a way where you have to record hour by hour the activity. So if it falls, some of the healing activity, conversations, work, education falls outside that contract, then you have to fund that elsewhere.
And at least in Illinois, a lot of our services that run through foster care go through Medicaid now. So that's a whole other, again, a whole other panel on how that affects our ability to provide quality services, but talk about hour by hour documentation. Yeah.
This is not an excuse not to do it. I feel like I sound like a provider now. The tables have turned here. So I just want to say, it's not an excuse not to do the work. We have to get creative as those of us who are leading organizations to figure it out. But it is a big frustration.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
and
this is, yeah, don't let this be a barrier to you or scare you off for people wanting to join this in this work. Go
I was
ahead,
just
Tim.
going to briefly add, Rashawn. So what we hear quite a bit about is the capacity of the people doing the work. So when we try to approach with similar questions, how do we get foster care systems, child welfare systems to a place of being trauma responsive or informed? One of the biggest questions we get back from administrators is, what am I going to be asking of people? And what are you going to have me take away from what I'm currently asking of them now? And I think there are constructive ways to make arguments around, even from a data point of view or otherwise. There's an ounce of, prevention, pound of cure. There is some additional efforts, but it will definitely pay off in the end. But the other piece that I think is true for people is guardians and people in guardian capacity right now are really struggling. Whether it's high caseloads, whether it's sort of other mental health related issues, whether it's sort of, more intense demands from folks being served. The truth about those providing care right now is worth also putting on the table and trying to figure out how to solve that problem, because it is a real problem that many will talk about.
I guess we can probably continue on this line on just like the federal burdens and the funding burdens, but how do we shift? The question is, how do we shift systems to be more restorative and healing at the local level when the system is kind of burdened down by federal policy and regulation and funding? I get some more money for that capacity building and training first, right? Increase the flexibility.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a swing at that but I would rather defer to others.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the opportunities in the past couple of years, many have referenced this, is the appreciation and understanding of overwhelming stress and trauma is probably at its apex for all sorts of obvious reasons. So I think, and again, this is a plug to CTIP, there's a unique opportunity to leverage the upside of that, because there's so much downside of that, to say, how do we as a community become resilient? How do we sort of solve and sort of address these problems at the community level? We would love to have communities get to the place where they're so healthy, these systems either don't exist, or honestly, the need for them is scaled way, way back. And I think, again, we've got a once and maybe a lifetime opportunity to leverage the experience that we've all been through and say, let's address this problem in a real, forthright, and fundamental way. That would be pretty cool.
Yep, seizing the moment. I'll let others jump in if they want to. If not,
The only thing I'll say is, I think as we leave here, I think there's a couple of things that I would center. Number one, I would center the idea that we haven't discovered all the interventions that are needed. Like at one point, you used to go to a therapist for anger management, and now there's like anger management 12-step courses, right? And like people have figured out how to package those. And I think we haven't figured out all the interventions and therapeutic programs that could be created for the common but unique experience that young people have in this situation of foster care. The second thing, I feel like every single action that we take should be driving towards like, how do we ensure that young people are loved past this contractual agreement, past a licensing standard? Like, how do you actually have a young person find family and find love? And then the supports that are required to like make that love even foster even more, go even more, because you have the right supports. So those are the two things I would just leave everybody with. It's like center those two things as we go forward.
I think that's excellent. I think we're at time, so I'm just gonna wrap up and just leave the floor open to just any lasting thoughts from our panelists before I turn it over to Amber. All right. All right. Well, I think I can speak for everyone when I say I had a lot of fun with this. I learned a lot. This has been such a treat, being with the chain breakers. But yeah, thank you, panelists, for shedding some light on this important issue, imparting your insights. We'll make sure folks get your contact information that you want shared, and folks a reminder to share, to save the chat, all those resources in there. Tons of great stuff in there. And just another shout out that we're continuing this conversation until April. This is twice a month until April, so the conversation won't stop now. It won't stop now because I need to introduce Amber, which is a real treat. So to introduce Amber, Amber was one of the first participants in the Youth Villages Life Step program in New Hampshire. The evidence-based program serves as a bridge to adulthood for young people who experience foster care and is helping more than 5,000 transition-age youth in 13 states in DC this year. As Amber left foster care, a Life Step specialist was by her side to help her reach employment, housing, and educational goals. She returned to college at River Valley Community College, pursuing a degree in social services, obtaining a full-time job. Oh, congratulations. She has her own apartment. Her own apartment, and manages her health needs. Amber works as a youth peer support specialist and at Youth Move New Hampshire, where she uses her lived experience in child welfare to advocate for other young people so that they have the choice and voice in their wellness and future planning. This is goals. All right, without further ado, Amber, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So my name is Amber Goodrich, and I'm 23 years old, and I'm from New Hampshire. I was born in Weymouth, Massachusetts, as the youngest child of 3. I lost my father at a very young age, leaving me with my mother, who battled with addiction and untreated traumas, which created many mental health problems and left her incapable of caring for herself or her children. I was placed in foster care when I was 11 years old, and I was moved around frequently with any possible forever home returning me like I was a broken product they got from the store. As I grew older and got harder to place, I was eventually put in a residential facility for 3 years until I aged out of foster care. During my time in residential, I lived with 13 other girls, where there was 1 staff member for every 4 girls, meaning we always had eyes on us. We would have to ask to use the bathroom, and we would have planned outside time. We were restricted to timed phone calls and had limited access to the internet, and we had a schedule made for us, and every single thing we did had a time limit attached. I had no control and limited real life opportunities to learn from. When I aged out of care, I transitioned to college life, where there was no one watching, no schedules, and no one I needed permission from. For the first time in my entire life, I could decide for myself, and I decided very wrong. I was unprepared for adulthood due to a lack of normalcy, independence, and consistency. While academically capable of going to college, I struggled to maintain balance between friends and responsibilities. I depended on my friends for the emotional support and guidance most young people get from their families. I felt like I was a part of something when I partied with my friends, and I overattached myself because I didn't have anyone else. In 2 months, I partied and I drank enough to fail out of my classes and be asked to leave school. When I left college, I strongly believed that I would not be able to return or overall succeed in life, and that I would be stuck in a cycle of chaos and failure. And I accepted this for almost 2 years before I hit absolute rock bottom. I was homeless, living out of my car and staying with friends. I knew I wanted better for my life, but I didn't know how to get there. One day I reached out to my aftercare worker, Tracy Smiley, and she not only provided me with information for services regarding housing, food security, and aftercare programs and college scholarships, but most importantly, she gave me the reassurance that I too could be successful and happy regardless of my past. She had hope for me when I did not have it for myself. I was able to get a job and get back on my feet. I was able to get my own apartment, giving me some stability and security to think about my future. While I was stable, I wanted consistency and still lacked the confidence to want more for myself. I didn't see my potential, and that's where LifeSet, a program of youth villages, came in for me. LifeSet eased me into the waters of being comfortable with my independence, being able to recover from minor setbacks and maintain my stability. LifeSet guided me to consistency with normalcy and independence by exploring my natural supports and resources in my community. It helped me with accountability for myself to manage things like applying for college scholarships and job applications, and I was able to get a job at NFI North, where I once was in residential program at. I work with youth potentially facing the same challenges I once did and help them find their voice to advocate for themselves. I was able to get back into college, now working on my social services degree, and I'm in my 3rd semester in hopes that one day that I can make the same impact in others' lives. Most importantly, I have gained consistency in my life, and I have gained stability and now my own hope for my future. And I hope that all youth and young adults over the age of 16 involved in the child welfare system will have access to high quality services and programs like LifeSet, as they can be so life-changing. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, Amber, that was extraordinary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was amazing, and congratulations. like you did it. You did it. Oh, I'm looking at Karen. Okay, Karen, you're back, so I guess you're taking it from here.
Just for a minute, and I want to also thank Amber for your clear message about how, you know, our focus, our charge needs to be partnering with people like you in your journey and making sure that you have hope and there is no messages about being broken, and that you have what you need. So, and thank you so much for sharing that very poignant and inspirational and clarifying message that really brought us home today. Thank you. And congratulations on all you've accomplished. So I'm here just for like 30 seconds. I'm passing it to Denny, and then we're on our way out today. But I want to just bring it to a close, our official session. I want to thank everyone who really stepped up today. Carrie, Richmond, and then Rashawn, your facilitation of this panel, and then Sixto Cancel, Michelle Grimes, Tim Grove, Jazz Snell, and then of course Amber. I also want to just take a moment to thank Alana Levinson and Chris Moore, who was on our subcommittee to pull this panel together. Thank you for your work as well. So, you know, we learned a lot, and I heard many challenges, many things we have to confront. We still have to learn. We have to work to do differently and better. And I also heard a lot of messages of hope that we're in a unique time right now, and there's so much synergy and energy to do this. So anyway, thank you for all you shared. Thank you for those that are interested. Thank you for those that are doing this work. And I'm going to pass it back to Denny. Denny, you're muted. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, and I was saying profound things. No, thank you all so much. I am so moved. Amber, I have to just call you out. You're a beacon of light and hope. And I think this session has been healing for those of us who have experienced trauma and trying to ensure that no child ever experiences it again. And we'll all, live our lives, building this movement to make sure that this is really embedded in our mindsets, in our systems, and in our policies. I also want to say that when we first planned this, I thought, well, gosh, child welfare and transitioning children should come before the justice system. But it turned out not to be the case, because those folks that presented in our first panel having to do with the justice system really got to the roots of the problem. It was just really deeply discussed where many of these problems are emanating from, and how these aspects of our justice system, law enforcement, courts, and corrections can really address some of these problems earlier before they, we want to avert children away from the justice system by attending to what's actually happening with regard to trauma and ACEs. And then, we got to the child welfare system and transitioning youth, and it just flowed so well. And it has been informative, but not only informative, instructive. And I mean instructive in terms of giving us a guiding light of where we need to go next. There's still so much left to discuss. We really need to talk about sort of the operations of, how do we operationalize all this? How do we really get into systems? How do we deal with the barriers that we're likely to encounter? Where are the strengths and systems that we can draw out that will help, those who have been affected really move beyond the trauma and actually reduce the trauma that's emanating from the systems itself? So we have a lot of work to do, but this trauma series is really the beginning of really just a tremendous national movement with potential for such impact on so many levels. And so I want to thank my partners, CTIP and PACES. I also want to call out, Chris Moore, who Karen already mentioned, from Child Trends, and Alana Levinson from Social Currents, just so I can kind of locate them in a place that helped to develop this last panel. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Jesse for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Denny. And before I do, Alana, I was actually going to highlight your comment in the chat very quickly. And so in thanks for all you've done with others to help put together this panel, I'm curious if you would like to just speak to the need to get to the root causes to break these cycles in the first place before I close out with some final remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Jesse. And I think, the hope is that we'll be able to work with you all at CTIP and others to continue the conversation, because I think this was only the very tip of the iceberg. And I think we want to have more conversations about challenges within the child welfare system. And Social Current does a lot of work around prevention and child abuse prevention, partnering with many of the folks who are on the call today. We work on advocacy around the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act and funding for that. So, we welcome other folks to join us in that. We'll be able to share resources and information, but just to share that, there's much more to the conversation, and we really want to go deeper into root causes so that we don't have a need for these systems, that we really are getting to families earlier and parents who have experienced their own trauma to help support families and keep them together when possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Alana. And that's really, again, the point of this series. Like I said in my opening remarks, right? We hope to empower advocates and get everybody involved to address these talking points and highlight that this really is just the tip of the iceberg, as long as these series seem to be going, and we will work to make them a little bit more concise. There is also just so much information, and we can go so much deeper, and we look forward to continuing to engage with communities and other organizations and leaders in these spaces so that we can continue to dive deeper and further understand what is needed, where our systems are working and where they are failing, and promote transformation moving forward. Next, or in 2 weeks rather, at the same time, We will have a transformative justice workshop, which will talk about systems change and should be provocative itself. And then we will also have a panel of faith-based leaders who are integrating trauma-informed and ACEs and PACEs messaging and prevention science into their work as a community coalescer. And so we invite everybody to join then. Please invite others to the workshop series. We want to continue to get the message out about these workshops. Remember that they are recorded, and we continue to put on or are putting together a resource center. And in the link, or in the chat rather, I just put the link to the breakout rooms for after each workshop session. So that way folks can join and we can come together and discuss with others. We recognize that on this platform, the chat moves very quickly, and there isn't that opportunity for relationship building that is so important in this work. And so for now, we have this separate workshop or breakout room Zoom link, which if you didn't get that, and I'll put it one more time, but if you don't grab it out of the chat, you can find it on the NPSC website where you signed up for this series. And with that, just want to thank all of our wonderful panelists, everybody who helped to organize. Denny, you thank everybody, but thank you for your leadership in this space as well, and for all that NPSC does. Amber, and to Bill, who had to leave, thank you for sharing your stories, and for everybody who's still on the line, thank you for your interest in all of the work you do. We look forward to continuing to build the movement and transforming our systems so that way we get to those root causes that Alana was talking about and work toward a better world together. So with that, thank you all. I will go ahead and open those breakout rooms.
Thank you again, everybody. Have a good weekend.